In the 1990s, Colin Ireland would terrorise London's gay community.
It is one of the most horrific and demanding murder inquiries for years.
Over 3 months, 5 innocent men would die at the hands of this cold and calculating killer.
He said the man he'd killed was gay.
Why are you doing this?
Colin Ireland would be christened the Gay Slayer and had set himself a unique goal.
He makes a New Year's resolution to himself that he's going to become a serial killer.
Ireland would snuff out the lives of his unsuspecting victims in a series of cruel and bizarre crimes.
The scene that met us there was just one of horror. Never seen anything like it before or since.
So was the Gay Slayer made into a monster, or was he born to kill?
I'm probably 60–70% quite a reasonable human being most of the time. But there is that side of my character that is negative. It's quite cold and calculating.
This is the confession of Colin Ireland.
I strangled him. I had a bit of cord.
In 1993, he would take the lives of 5 men in a killing spree that frustrated police and struck fear into London's gay community.
Your advice to the gay community tonight?
Yes, quite simple. Be careful. Don't pick up a stranger. Don't go out on one-night stands. It's dangerous. You could be next.
The methods and motives for his evil actions would not be revealed until this frank and disturbing interview.
I went and got a plastic bag from the kitchen, carrier pack, and I stuck it over his head.
Ireland's life and crimes give us a unique insight into the mind of a serial killer and the 40-year journey that led him to make the cruelest of New Year's resolutions.
It's a destructive element to me that is highly destructive, highly cold, and very cold. And I think in some moods, I'm quite happy to burn the world down if possible.
Colin Ireland was born on March the 16th, 1954, and from day one his life would be full of disappointment and failure. Colin Ireland's father wanted no part in bringing up a child and left before he was even born.
Ireland never knew his biological father, and I think that's quite an important thing to note, because we have to remember what England was like in the early 1950s, where that kind of birth out of wedlock would be regarded very badly by the local community.
His 17-year-old mother was left with no money and no choice but to move back in with her parents in Myrtle Road, Dartford.
His mother was a very poor person.
On a number of occasions, Ireland's mother would move him in the hope that she would be able to settle with him in other accommodation.
She appeared to be very much into wanting to give him something that was good, wanting to make things good for him, but it didn't work out.
Colin Ireland's formative years were an unhappy time, filled with extreme hardship, upheaval, and poverty. Rent problems would sometimes lead to sudden moves.
I think he was probably really hurt by it. I'm sure any child would be, coming home from school and finding that their home is no longer their home and their mother has moved off somewhere.
So we've got a young man whose pattern of early life is characterized by movement, disruption, and an anxiety that somehow he doesn't quite fit in and that there are people talking about him.
In 1970, at the age of 16, Ireland fled to London, where he began to hang around at an amusement arcade with an unsavoury reputation.
We now know this is a particularly disreputable amusement arcade because it's targeted and frequented by paedophiles who will particularly target young boys what I think we begin to see is Ireland's association with sexual subcultures.
Most serial killers, men who kill men, are themselves gay. Most heterosexual serial killers kill women. What often happens in a case like this is that Ireland himself may be homosexual or may have a strong aspect of homosexuality to his personality, but can't accept it. He doesn't want to accept that. And so there's a part of him that he hates. And by killing others, he's sort of reassuring himself that he's not gay, that's not part of his personality.
Ireland's later teens were also to prove turbulent, and he began racking up an impressive criminal record, spending many periods in and out of both Borstal and prison.
I think he had a list of about 50 or 30 court appearances, all relatively minor offences to begin with. TDA, burglary, deception. He wasn't your GBH merchant, he wasn't your rapist, he wasn't your armed robber.
In between stints of incarceration, Ireland tries his hand at various jobs, but none lasted. One in particular, though, would yet again provide Ireland with a vital key to a specific community later on in life.
I believe he was a bouncer on a gay club in one job.
It's almost impossible to determine whether or not he himself was gay. What matters is Ireland's understanding of a number of gay sexual subcultures.
It was around 1981 when Colin met his first wife, and whilst he was working as a security guard, he befriended fellow worker Colin Brown.
He was a biggish guy and that. He seemed pretty quiet. Then once we got to know each other, then he started chatting and everything. And that was when I started going to his flat in Holloway. Colin's wife was in a wheelchair, Victoria. He seemed like he doted over her and that, you know what I mean? He couldn't do enough for her. When I went there, it was a pleasant home life, you know what I mean?
I think it's quite interesting that his first wife is disabled and he instead can dominate her because he's providing a caring service, as he would see it.
Ireland had seemingly got his life on track and was doing all he could to be a respected member of the community.
He and another man would patrol the local area where they were living.
We would go out late in the evening and we would have a torch and that, and if there was anything that we saw that maybe wasn't toward, we would report it to the local police.
There's always this sense of a kind of perverted moral hierarchy, a desire to be someone in a community, and of course performing the role as an informal neighbourhood patrol officer would give Ireland that sense of paying something back, that sense of having some standing.
Nevertheless, the harmonious, respectable life Ireland had constructed for himself crumbled just 5 years later after he was caught having an affair. But no one could foresee the tragic and brutal consequences of Colin Ireland's turbulent youth, criminal career, and brushes with London's gay community. In 1993, Colin Ireland would take the lives of 5 innocent gay men. But what was his motive for murder? Was the man who became known as the Gay Slayer born to kill? Ireland had an unstable childhood and a failed marriage. Then in 1989, on a survival weekend in Devon, he meets his second wife-to-be, Janet Young.
I first met Colin Ireland when I owned the Globe Inn pub where I live, and he came in as a customer. He stood in the doorway, dressed in camouflage, very impressive figure. The conversation just stopped dead in the pub as he came in the door.
Janet quickly falls for the stranger, although not everybody is immediately so keen on him.
My barmaid at the time, she didn't like him at all. She warned me off him right from the word go. She said, no, there's something not right. But I didn't feel that. I felt he was ideal for me in my situation, so he gradually moved in.
The customers didn't warm to Colin behind the bar, and neither did he feel happy serving them.
He hated being behind the bar. He wasn't really a very good mixer, although he was friendly. I think people in the pub found him a little bit scary because he was a very tall, big man. He was with me for about 3 months before he asked me to marry him. I wasn't sure that I wanted to get married, but he said, if we don't trust one another, then what's the point of being together? We had a small reception and a really fun day. He'd fitted in really well. My children were prepared to accept him being there. He liked being with them. I think it made him feel accepted and normal.
However, 4 months into the marriage, he proves that everything is far from normal. Ireland drives Janet and the kids to her mother's home for the weekend. They would never see each other again.
Ireland conforms to a classic psychopath, always taking from somebody what he needs to have so as to continue in the lifestyle that he wants.
I feel that certain sides of my character, not all of me, by any means, I mean, I'm probably 60–70% quite a reasonable human being most of the time. But there is that side of my character that is negative, that's quite cold and calculating.
Ireland now has Janet and the kids safely out of the way.
Ireland will go back to the pub and take money from the pub, enough to set himself up again.
I was just shocked. I didn't know what had happened to him. I thought he'd been killed, run over, in hospital, arrested.
With over £10,000 of Janet's cash and their wedding photo album, Colin abandons her and his life behind the bar of the Globe Inn.
I realised he was probably just a con man all along, and I fell for it, and he was just looking for his opportunity to get what he could and go.
Travelling to Southend-on-Sea, Ireland once again begins to build a new life for himself. In 1991, he applies to be a volunteer at a local homeless shelter.
The moment Colin arrived at the night shelter as a volunteer, I do remember because he's a very, very large man, and he stood in the doorway and just advised me that he'd been sent by another agency. He was very passionate about the work that he did, probably more passionate than any of the other volunteers that we had. And he genuinely felt that he was paying society back after having behaved in various ways that he himself admitted were not very good.
For almost 6 months, life at the shelter seemed to be providing Ireland with all he needed to lead a fulfilled existence. But true to form, it wasn't to last.
Colin was a very calm person, but he was also a person that you felt immediately that you wouldn't want to upset.
Other volunteers don't like his manner, find him quite overbearing, find him frightening.
Volunteers and Ireland remain at loggerheads over the coming months, until one final incident seals his fate.
The assistant manager came to me and felt that Colin's behaviour on occasions wasn't appropriate, and she was rather concerned about this. That matter was taken to the committee, and they decided then that it probably would be a good idea to let Colin go. He felt that his dismissal was unfair and unjustified. He also felt that he had given back something to society, and basically that hadn't been recognised.
Once again, he finds himself rejected and on the fringes of society. For Colin Ireland, it's the final straw.
I believe that getting dismissed from the night shelter was crucial to his future. It was an absolutely crucial part of what happened to him and why he went on to do what he did.
To become the somebody he's always craved to be, Ireland will have to try a different tack.
He had read a book written by Robert Ressler called Whoever Fights Monsters. And therefore Ireland says he's going to become famous. He's going to become a somebody in the community. At that point, he makes a New Year's resolution to himself that he's going to become a serial killer.
On the 8th of March 1993, Colin Ireland arrives at the Colhern pub. Tonight he will begin his campaign of violence. Back in the early 90s, the Colhern was hugely popular with the gay community, and in particular the centre of a thriving S&M scene.
Colhern, back in the early 1990s, of an evening would be absolutely heaving. And you'd have people in here, clientele, who would identify whichever sexual proclivity was there to their taste, which made targeting by Colin Ireland extremely easy.
There were a whole series of signals. If you were into this, you'd wear this color handkerchief. If you were into that, you'd wear another one if you had it in one pocket or another.
Most heterosexual men would feel uncomfortable going into a gay bar and speaking to someone who is gay, getting them to come with you. You would have to have some degree of comfort or experience in doing that.
And so it's his understanding of that subculture which gives him the passport to enter areas in London which were quite secret. And it's his understanding of that, having that passport, which allows him to kill repeatedly, time after time.
In a unique insight into a serial killer's mind, Colin Ireland explains during his police confession how the horrific events unfolded that evening when he killed and tortured his innocent victim.
I went to Colhern that evening. I felt if I was approached by one of that group type that tended to trigger these things in me, these masochistic men, I felt that time, I felt there was a likelihood that I would kill.
It's not long before Ireland is approached by theatre director Peter Walker. They strike up a conversation and travel back to Walker's flat together.
I went into the flat and I bound him to I tied him to the bed.
Before killing Peter Walker, Ireland demands money from his now helpless victim, forcing Walker to reveal his bank card and PIN number by burning his testicles with a lighter.
I went and got a plastic bag from the kitchen, carrier bag, and I stuck it over his head.
As dawn approached, Colin Ireland left Walker's flat, withdrew £200 from a cash machine, and returned to his life in Southend.
Ireland was looking forward, I imagine, to reading about the death of Peter Walker in the papers, for it to be on the news, whether it was the local news or the national news. And of course, when Peter's murder doesn't make front page news, in fact, isn't even reported upon, Ireland takes it upon himself to do two things. First, he phones the Samaritans, and secondly, he phones the Sun newspaper.
I've personally taken thousands upon thousands of phone calls, and I've never taken a phone call like that. The guy sounded very normal, very ordinary, and was just started talking about two dogs locked in a flat. And I kept politely saying, I'm really sorry, but it's not a story for the Sun. And then he just suddenly dropped this bombshell that the reason he was actually phoning us was that he wanted the dogs to be freed because he'd killed their owner.
He didn't know it at the time, but the call Malinsky had just received marked the beginning of a vicious killing spree by one of Britain's coldest and most calculating serial killers.
He said the man he'd killed was gay and that he was interested in kinky sex, was the way he put it. I tried to keep him talking to get as much information as I could.
The police were alerted, and Detective Martin Finnegan rushed to the scene.
The door had been opened by the caretaker, So we got in without having to break any doors down. The dogs are in the lounge, and the bedroom was in disarray, as if it had been ransacked, the sort of thing you'd expect from a burglary.
It soon becomes apparent the phone call is no hoax. Before them lies the dead body of Peter Walker.
The body was discovered in the bed, and we knew that he had died at another person's hand.
The one other thing that the murderer had mentioned to me on the phone, he said he'd trussed him up like a chicken, is what he said to me on the phone.
He had a condom on his nose, condom in his mouth. He had 2 teddy bears placed on his chest in what was sort of 69 position.
On the post-mortem, we found out he died of asphyxia, inhaling his own vomit, so he'd been suffocated at some point, and we knew that ligatures had been removed after he was dead. So we're dealing with somebody who is a cool customer there.
The mysterious caller may have wanted to alert police to his crimes, but that didn't mean he wanted to be caught. He had left no clues and seemingly had committed the perfect murder. With the media finally reporting on Peter Walker's death and an investigation underway, Ireland lies low during the following weeks.
In most serial killing sprees, there is usually a wider gap between the first and the second murder. Usually the serial killer in that first murder gains psychologically what it is that he wants to gain out of that murder, and therefore doesn't feel the need to kill again particularly quickly.
The police struggle to find conclusive evidence to catch Walker's murderer, and for the time being the investigation stalls. So satisfied he has got away with it, Ireland returns to London to continue on his horrifying quest to become a serial killer. Having made a New Year's resolution to become a serial killer, Colin Ireland had already brutally murdered his first victim and was now ready to kill again, moving one step closer to his goal. On May the 28th, 1993, Christopher Dunn, a 37-year-old librarian, approached Colin Ireland at the bar of the Colhern.
Christopher Dunn is also somebody who is gay, interested in sadomasochism, is also somebody who frequents the Colhern pub, the pub where Ireland is going to have a passport to because he understands the codes, the subculture.
In his confession, Ireland would reveal just what a terrifyingly cold and calculated killer he'd become.
We got talking, realised he was the type. I went back to his place, North London, Willesden I think it was, and I'd gone quite prepared this time to kill them. And I bought a very inexpensive pair of handcuffs, and I was carrying a small torch, a magnite and a pouch, and a couple of other things, a lock knife and a Leatherman, which is like a multi-tool device. And I'd got a book and a pen, and I was going to have him repeat his PIN number, and I strangled him. I had a bit of cord. On both of those occasions I stayed with the bodies until 6, half past 6 in the morning, because I didn't, that was a vulnerable time, because I still had stuff on me that would have been a bit awkward if I'd been stopped by a policeman.
As dawn approached, Colin Ireland left the home of the now dead Christopher Dunn.
On the 28th of May, the body of Christopher Dunn was found in his home at Whetstone. And again, the scene was very staged. He was lying in a harness, naked except for the harness. He'd suffered ligature strangulation.
Even though before them lay a corpse, at the time, police didn't suspect foul play.
And I understand that inquiry led the police to believe that was a sex game that had gone tragically wrong, and there was no suggestion to believe it was anything other than a pure accident, and it was treated as such. It was not treated as a murder.
With 2 separate detective teams investigating the Walker and Dunn murders, the similarities between the cases were overlooked. 6 days later, and Ireland was back cruising the Colhern, He had seemingly got away with murder for a second time and was looking for a new victim. This time, it was 33-year-old Perry Bradley who caught his eye.
Ireland had to persuade Bradley that, he should allow Ireland to tie him up.
We went back to the flat, and I don't think he was so much into the S&M, but I said I had to. So it's going to be a long night. I said I suggest you get some sleep if you can. And I just sat and listened to the radio, and he actually went to sleep. And while he was asleep, I told him with the noose, and he hardly struggled.
Ireland again sat up all night with just a corpse for company.
I think that affected me mentally to quite a degree. I think maybe if I'd have killed these people and gone, I wouldn't have been affected mentally so much, but sitting in with these bodies for sort of like 5 or 6 hours on some occasions, watching them gradually sort of get blotchy as they do and cold, and it wasn't something that I don't think I could cope with, to be honest with you. I wasn't dealing with it too well.
In his quest to commit the perfect murder, Ireland treated the crime scenes carefully, revealing during his police confession how he had emulated a scene out of the TV police drama The Bill.
Got this one off The Bill, and that was taking the batteries out of the torch and wiping prints off of those and putting them back in with gloves on. You ought to ban that programme.
When Colin Ireland left the crime scene, he took with him every single thing that he touched.
So he doesn't want to leave blood, semen, hair, fibres, fingerprints.
As Ireland travels back to Southend-on-Sea, he disposes of incriminating items he removed from the home of Dunn by throwing them out of the moving train, where they would blend in with rubbish on the track below. Colin Ireland's New Year's resolution was coming together. He was fast approaching the serial killer status, which in his mind would catapult him into a world of infamy and repute.
Colin contacted me after he'd left the night shelter and asked if he could pop round for a cup of tea occasionally just to keep in touch. He told myself and my wife at the time that he was going on survival technique weekends. We subsequently found out that that wasn't the case. He was going to London to murder people.
On the 7th of June, just 3 days after Christopher Dunn's murder, Ireland again travelled by train from Southend to London, where he made his way to a familiar haunt, the Colhern.
For Colin Ireland to go back to the Colhern again just shows his degree of confidence he had in getting away with it. He'd clearly established a formula. He'd identified the secretive lifestyle of the clientele that frequented the Colhern, and with some confidence could say that his approach worked.
33-year-old Andrew Collier fatefully approached Colin Ireland. They struck up a conversation and soon left for Collier's flat. There, Ireland would engage in his most shocking behaviour yet.
When we eventually got into the flat at Andrew Collier's place, the scene that met us there was just one of horror. Never seen anything like it before or since. Andrew Collier was laying on his back with the cat draped across his chest. He was naked. In his mouth were 2 condoms, and on the cat's tail was a condom, and his penis had been put inside the cat's mouth and closed. If you can try and picture that, it's just so strange.
Not until Ireland's eventual confession did investigators truly understand why he had left the scene in such a bizarre way.
I felt real anger towards him, because he thought there was going to be a normal sexual encounter, which there wasn't going to be, and then had AIDS, and at no time did he warn me. I was on a sort of almost like a roller coaster thing, and I felt, you know, there was more I was doing, you know.
While searching Andrew Collier's flat, Ireland discovers medical documents that reveal Collier is HIV positive.
He therefore, as a consequence of that knowledge, strangles Andrew Collier's cat, and he's going to engage in post-death behaviours in ways which are frankly quite disgusting. Ireland is trying to buy the public's sympathy by saying this man was not only gay and interested in sadomasochism, he was also HIV positive.
Colin Ireland had now brutally murdered 4 gay men, but there was still no media outcry. He was being denied recognition for his hard work, and Ireland could keep his silence no longer.
Ireland again injects himself into the police investigation. He's going to phone the police.
When Colin spoke to my colleague and CID officer at Battersea, he wanted to know why we'd stopped the investigation into Peter Walker.
He was losing out on fame and notoriety, so he named all of the victims and was quite adamant about the fact that he had killed all 4.
Why are you doing this? But why in particular homosexuals?
Colin said, I'm going to keep going till I'm caught. I'll do another one. I've always dreamed of doing the perfect murder.
The impact on police was absolutely immense. This was a huge inquiry now.
The police begin one of the biggest investigations in recent history, determined to catch the killer, who was not only targeting gay men, but also taunting the police as he did so.
It is one of the most horrific and demanding murder inquiries for years.
Scotland Yard suddenly went into this dramatic, madly, absurdly dramatic midnight press conference and this dramatic announcement that a serial killer of gay men was at large.
Advice to the gay community tonight.
Yes, quite simple. Be careful. Don't pick up a stranger. Don't go out on one-night stands. It's dangerous. You could be next.
By the middle of June 1993, despite the police's best efforts, Ireland has already struck again. Taunting the police with yet another phone call, Ireland suggests they look for a corpse at a house fire.
Eventually, a phone call came in from the police down in Lewisham saying that there's a flat with blackened windows and smoke billowing out, and inside was the body of a man who turned out to be Manuel Spiteri.
His 5th victim is a Maltese chef called Emanuel Spiteri, and Ireland is going to make a mistake because he goes back yet again to the Culhern pub.
I didn't talk to him then. I saw him on the tube station a little bit later. Got talking to him then, and he said he'd seen me a couple of times in the Culhern and he was interested physically. We went via a couple of different train journeys to his flat. I put a noose around his neck. I then I've reached a point where I couldn't stop myself anyway. It was almost like a steamroller effect. It was if you could call it steamroller, roller coaster, whatever.
Again, all the same methodology was used, the ligatures, the handcuffs. They were all removed after the murder, but this time, before he left, he stacked all the bedding and clothing in the centre of the room and set fire to it. Again, it was to heighten that impact on the investigators. I'm sure that's what it was for.
If you look at the crime scenes from number 1 to number 5, when he set fire to the house, to Spiteri's house, this was building up. So he said he was on a roller coaster, and I'm sure he was on a roller coaster.
But now the once careful killer was getting sloppy. He'd become uncontrollably addicted to murder.
Police hunting the killer of 5 homosexual men in London have been appealing for help at a big gay rights demonstration in the capital.
Colin Richardson, the then editor of Gay Times, remembers the effect the police investigation had on the gay community.
I vividly recall the Pride festival that year.
Tens of thousands of homosexuals streamed through central London in their annual gesture of pride and identity. But this year it was against a sombre background. Police and stewards handed out thousands of leaflets appealing for information about the serial killer who's murdered 5 times and is terrorising London's gay community.
There really was a palpable sense of fear. The press, of course, were making it much worse. I don't remember which paper it was, but one of them had a headline which was Fairy Liquidator. A lot of them latched onto the phrase gay slayer.
Got a serial killer on our hands, that's the bottom line, is that we need help to catch him.
Now the gay community was on high alert, but despite the massive police hunt underway, Colin Ireland was still at large. At the beginning of 1993, Colin Ireland made a cold and twisted New Year's resolution to become a serial killer. 6 months later, he has murdered 5 men in London and has so far managed to evade the huge police investigation that has been mounted against him.
I believe it was around about June that year. Colin came in, he sat down, we were watching TV. The news was on and there was a report about the killings in London. And Colin turned to me and said, you know, what do you think of this thing? And my reply was, oh, there's another nutter on the loose. Had no idea that it was him.
With the gay community on high alert and a profile of the killer beginning to emerge, the police get a break they so desperately need from a witness via the London gay policing group Gallup.
He gave us vital information around what he saw on the night in question that Spiteri was killed. He said he was at Charing Cross, that he saw them both together, that they sat on the train. There was 2 girls on the train as well. So on the train journey down to Hither Green from Charing Cross, the witnesses on the carriage on the train gave us an excellent effort and gave us a good description of Spiteri and Ireland.
Using the witness information, the police now know the route Ireland and Spiteri took on their return journey home. It's not long before they get a CCTV image of Spiteri, accompanied by a large man. The footage and EFIT are both immediately made public. Richard Higgs, Ireland's former colleague, remembers his friend's odd behaviour on what was to be his last visit.
He came into the house. It was an evening, I believe it was a Sunday evening. He was very anxious. He behaved very strangely, and we were really quite disconcerted by it, made to feel rather uncomfortable. And we really just wanted him to leave. Gave him a lift back to where he was living at the time. And he was talking in the third tense, talking very strangely. He was muttering and mumbling and very uncomfortable to be around, and we just wanted to get away from him, basically.
Ireland began to realise that it wouldn't be long before someone identified him from the images in the media and decided he had to take action.
Colin Ireland, at this stage, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, made contact to the police through his solicitor.
He had a prepared statement where it said, yes, I was the man with Spiteri. I did go to his home in Hither Green, but there was another man indoors. I didn't want a threesome, so I slept in the local churchyard and then came back to Southend.
So what we did is got some very fast cars down to Southend, so he was actually arrested at the solicitor's office.
Finally, the police are confident they have their man in custody, but Ireland believes detectives have nothing to go on.
He never opened his mouth.
He stared unblinking at me the whole time. It was very, very unnerving. The only reaction I got was when I told him we had a fingerprint of his at Andrew Collier's.
During the Andrew Collier murder, Ireland had made a massive mistake. At some point during the evening of Collier's death, there had been a disturbance outside the flat. Ireland had gone to the window to see what was happening, leaving behind a fingerprint.
It would have been out here where the disturbance took place, which drew Andrew Collier and Colin Ireland to the window, and where Colin Ireland left that fingerprint for police to find.
When he was confronted with the fingerprint evidence at the Andrew Collier scene, that picture would have told a story of guilt to the jury, I've got no doubt whatsoever, because he was totally flummoxed. He just couldn't believe that he had made a mistake.
Whilst on remand, Colin Ireland has time to assess his situation. He thought he'd been so careful not to leave any forensic evidence, but the fingerprint at Andrew Collier's flat had been a blow. The police are going to charge him with the murders of Andrew Collier and Emmanuel Spiteri, but may not have enough evidence to charge him for the other three.
He was on remand, I think, for about 4 weeks, when I think he probably contemplated on where does he go now, because it's falling out of the limelight, and he hasn't got the label that he wanted as a serial killer because he's only been charged with 2 murders. This just wasn't good enough for him. So he informed the prison officers that he wanted to talk to police, he wanted to admit all 5, and that's exactly what he did. And there he got his label as a serial killer.
Colin Ireland begins his full and chillingly honest confession to the murders of 5 men from London's gay community.
There's a clear narcissistic quality to Ireland. He wanted to take credit for this, and he was very proud of what he did, as are many of these serial killers. They're very pleased with themselves.
When this comes to trial, any judge worth his salt is going to find me guilty, and he will imprison me, and by doing so allow me to not offend again for some time.
Ireland's ultimate confession is simply because he wanted to achieve the goal that he set out to achieve through his December 1992 New Year's resolution. He wanted to become famous.
During the interviews, I think Colin Ireland had a certain amount of self-satisfaction that he was able to tell us, even at that late stage, things we didn't know. Only he could illuminate us into that, and he did. And I think that gave him a sense of importance, achievement, possibly even superiority.
On the 20th of December 1993, at the Old Bailey, Colin Ireland pleads guilty to the murder of all 5 men.
A serial killer who preyed on homosexuals has been jailed for life for murdering 5 men in London earlier this year. The judge recommended that he never be released, saying, "To take 1 human life is an outrage. To take 5 is carnage."
So what was it that drove Colin Ireland to kill? A man who patrolled the streets of his neighbourhood, who helped out at a homeless shelter.
Lots of people would say that he was a nice Colin Ireland who worked at the shelter in Southend and would never think anything of him like that.
It was another person. It just, well, it struck me dumb, you know. That's all I can say.
Really what I knew most about his mind is that he did like to be in control.
If you think about serial killers, one of the things they have in their sense is that they are helpful and kind. They just are, again, mimicking what they see the world expecting them to do.
I often wonder whether Colin Ireland was born to kill, or whether it was a result of his certainly early life.
Now, something must have happened a year, 2 years before that to trigger in his mind that here he is, I'm going to kill.
He wanted to achieve a goal that many serial killers want to achieve, which is that they want status.
Whatever the reason for Ireland's senseless murders, in the end, even he agreed he was a danger to the world. Colin Ireland had snuffed out the lives of 5 innocent, unsuspecting men. On the 21st of February 2012, in prison, he would die with the dignity he had denied his victims, age 58, of natural causes. Cromwell Street, Gloucester, England. An ordinary house in an ordinary street. Number 25 was the home of a local builder and his wife, bustling with children and topped up to the brim with lodgers. The only thing that distinguished number 25 from the others was the amount of people that came and went. Fred West liked company. He also liked to maim, molest and murder. But was this seemingly ordinary man driven to the slaughter of at least 12 women and children? Or was Fred West born to kill? Fred West was described by Richard Ferguson, prosecuting QC of the trial of Rosemary West, as a man devoid of compassion, consumed with sexual lust, a sadistic killer, and someone who had opted out of the human race, the very epitome of evil. But who was Fred West?
If you passed Fred West in the street, you wouldn't give him a second glance. He had a wife and had 6 children.
Fred West was a chameleon. His neighbours would have told you that he was a very hard-working, likeable, friendly chap.
On the face of it was a completely ordinary builder, handyman, a very jovial fellow who got on well with everybody.
He did fit in with the normal flow of life, even though he was profoundly abnormal.
Many people would be taken in by him because he was plausible and charming. So the last thing in your mind is that he might actually harbour terrible evil.
The great mystery of the whole thing is what drove them to do this.
You're talking about two people who literally plumb the depths of human depravity.
Some people have the ambition to become a great politician, to succeed in the world of art. He had the ambition to succeed in sadistic sexual homicide.
You could put on this act as an amiable rogue, but it was only to put up some kind of disguise, and underneath that lurked this monster.
Someone may have evil written all over his face, and yet people miss it. Fred West's evil would be missed by very many people.
Frederick Stephen West was born on the 29th of September 1941 in the rural Hereford village of Much Marcle. A tiny agricultural community cut off from metropolitan life, this rural idyll would be where the young West grew up. The second of 6 siblings, Fred was a striking child with a shock of curly blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. But how did this blue-eyed boy turn into one of history's most vicious and heinous serial killers.
For Frederick West, this kind of landscape, obviously you can see a sense of freedom, and he will have had a lot of freedom, more freedom than most people would have had. But then again, this kind of landscape is also very brutal, and what goes with it is the kind of activities he had, such as clubbing to death rabbits, to watch his mother shotgunning rats, this kind of like physical and very kind of harsh environment.
It's widely believed that Fred's father, Walter, was a child abuser, and he seemed unashamed and unrepentant about his behaviour. Fred was very much the apple of his mother's eye, and her love could be described as more than overprotective.
Apparently for years they'd been having sort of sexual games together, and the minute he was capable of doing anything more than that, she initiated him. He was also abused by his father. It was a family in which incest was taken fairly much as normal. He was highly sexualised from a very young age, and sex became very much part of his motivation. He would talk constantly about sex.
Fred's school career was short and unproductive. He left school at 14, barely able to read and write. His IQ was later measured at just 80.
The problem there obviously lies that lots and lots of doors are then closed, and the doors that were open to Fred and his industrious, possibly attention deficit, hyperactive traits would be channeled into things like chasing girls, petty theft, problematic behaviour, little petty acts of violence, and possibly other activities that we don't as yet know about.
This would have turned him into a survivor, a lad that would live off the land, crude, get by as I can, get what I can, that he would be like a fox. And he didn't need good literacy skills to survive. He could survive on his wits.
Like many young boys, West became fascinated by motorbikes. He saved hard to buy his first machine, but his pride and joy was soon to become a nightmare. On the evening of November the 28th, 1958, whilst West was riding along this road, he collided with a girl riding in the opposite direction. The precise details of the accident remain a mystery, but West suffered multiple injuries, including a serious head wound. He lay unconscious in hospital for 7 days.
Like many unfortunate children, Frederick West did inherit certain brain abnormalities from his parents who had problems themselves. This reached a very much of a crescendo on this very road, which not only caused great damage to his body and the shortening of a leg, but delivered a massive amount of damage to his head and therefore to his brain. And the part of the brain that gets the head-on particular damage is the frontal cortex here, the frontal lobe, which contains the elements of what makes us a moral person, that will give you a sense of revulsion if that is a particularly horrific act. Now, for Fred, these were damaged, so someone who was already a little bit psychopathic suddenly had the brakes taken off completely and made him into a real danger to society.
Fred's recovery was slow and humiliating. His nose was broken. He walked with a pronounced limp and now suffered from violent mood swings.
He did lose a lot of his good looks. There was damage to his nose and other configurations. And from being quite a charmer and a crudely good-looking lad in the village, he lost a lot of that edge.
Fred compensated for the loss of his looks by taking a much more aggressive approach with the local girls.
If Fred wanted sex, he effectively would rape young girls in that community.
It would have been very much a kind of grab and grope situation, and he tended then, obviously, to use girls for the only kind of comfort that really ever existed for Fred in his entire life, and that was sex and control.
One girl Fred couldn't control was Catherine Costello, better known as Rena. She was a 16-year-old prostitute who'd moved to Gloucester from her native Glasgow. Fred married Rena, despite her being 5 months pregnant with another man's child.
I think Fred saw in Rena certain elements of his mother. It was a strong person who would control him, and he was put in his place, if you like, for the first time probably in his life by a female. But I don't think he was ever comfortable with her. He was never really someone that he could see as a soulmate. She was really a mother substitute.
Charmaine West was born in the March of 1963 and was soon followed by a little sister, Anne-Marie. Childhood for the two little girls was far from traditional.
Rena and he had a very on and off life together. Sometimes they were together, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes he had both the children, sometimes these children were in foster care. Occasionally Rena took the children. Mostly, if they weren't in care, they were with Fred. Fred found a succession of young women to look after them. It was a very up and down, strange life.
This turbulent relationship finally reached breaking point in 1965. Rena feared for her own safety and fled back to Scotland. Fred had been happy to let her go, but not the children, and he'd already recruited 16-year-old Anna McFall to act as their nanny.
Anne McFall, Fred always maintained, was in his words, the love of his life. In fact, when he was in prison awaiting trial before he committed suicide, he wrote a great big sort of catalogue of his relationship with Anne McFall, which he entitled I Loved an Angel.
But the angel was soon to fall when she became pregnant with West's child.
She became effectively a problem to Fred, an obstruction who had to be removed. It sounds extraordinarily callous, but Fred was the kind of man who, if a woman presented a problem, she effectively would be removed from his life.
Anna McFall was last seen in the July of 1967.
Fred West would have thought that people were disposable because, as far as he was concerned, other people were instruments to be used. So there would be no ethical boundaries.
He decided that he'd had enough of her and that she was surplus to his requirements, and as cold-blooded as this may seem, he destroyed her and buried her.
27 years later, the remains of Anna McFall were discovered in this field on the outskirts of Fred's home village, Muchmarkle, in Herefordshire. The body had been decapitated and dismembered and was found with the skeleton of her unborn child.
He would not have had the same sense of revulsion that you and I would have had, of stripping the body and deciding how to dispose of it. He would be very industrious about this, and this would have set him apart from many, many attempted killers and attempted serial killers, in that he was very energetic, very industrious about the way he went about things.
Anna McFall had been the last of the victims to be recovered, but she'd been the first to die. She'd signalled a turning point in the murderous career of Frederick West. Fred West was just 12 years old when in November 1953 a young girl was born who was destined to be his partner in life and in death. The young Rosemary West's childhood was tragically similar to that of Fred. Her mother, Daisy, suffered from both severe depression and the attentions of a violent schizophrenic husband.
Her father was very, very abusive to his daughters, and the other daughters wouldn't tolerate it and moved out. In fact, I think the mother moved out at one stage. But from an early age, he would have been having sex with her, and she would be accepting it. The relationship with the father continued after Fred and Rose got together, and in fact, Rose's father would turn up at Cromwell Street even after Rose had 4 children to have sex with her, and then Fred would send her into the bedroom with Anne-Marie.
When Fred met Rose, he recognised what one might call a soulmate, and that's why he was attracted to her. They had a kind of interlocking psychopathology and background, so that they played off each other and their fantasies coincided probably.
Fred and Rose met in the quiet village of Bishop's Cleeve, Gloucestershire, England. Despite the age gap, they soon started a relationship, and it was not long before 17-year-old Rose was living with Fred and his two children, Charmaine and Anne-Marie, in their new home at 25 Midland Road, Gloucester.
That the two gelled sexually, probably almost from the off, really, probably saved Rose her life to start off with. I think she could have easily become another victim. She's using him for what she wants, a little perks, he's driving around in his car, and she's feeling much older. She can tell her girlfriends at school or wherever it is, oh, my boyfriend's older, all the time learning from Fred, who was a willing teacher and enjoying every minute of it. This was the cocktail that was going to start to put the bomb together that would soon explode.
Rose was soon pregnant and gave birth to Heather Ann in October 1970. Motherhood didn't come naturally.
This was something very, very new to Rose. She was very young. However, she did like children, but possibly not in the way that most adults would like children. For Rose, she'd always had a kind of learning disability and a slight intellectual challenge, and she found it much easier to sort of deal with small children, and she didn't like the kind of conflict of being challenged. So therefore, she would treat children more as kind of dolls, toys. They were kind of still objectified.
I remember asking her whether she ever breastfed, and she said, oh no, tits were for fucking, not for, breastfeeding children. So, there was this thing that made me wonder about, a mother's milk. It was something alien to Rose.
Rose was a very, very strict disciplinarian for all the West children. Their upbringing was very, very regimented. They were taken off to school. They were never, ever encouraged to make friends in the community. Rose ruled the West children with an iron rod.
Tragically, the child that suffered the most was 8-year-old Charmaine. Sometime in the June of 1971, while Fred West was coming to the end of a 9-month prison sentence for theft, Charmaine disappeared.
Once Rose had killed Shipman, then she is, of course, equally guilty. So she could not claim just to be an unwilling accomplice once she's done that. She has to continue.
This was, as it were, a shared experience. It is incredibly bonding, but in this case, bonding in immorality, because having disposed of a problematic, challenging child, which might have disrupted the relationship between Fred and Rose, then, as it were, nothing could be ruled out in terms of eliminating other factors that could threaten their relationship.
One of these factors was Charmaine's real mother, Rena.
She came looking for her child, and that, I'm afraid, sealed her fate, because she could not find... Charmaine was not there. Charmaine was dead. The only solution was to murder Rena.
Rena was last seen alive in the autumn of 1971. Her dismembered remains were found in Letterbox Field in Muchmarcle. Anna McFall already lay next door, degraded and discarded by West.
For Frederick West, this will have been his little playground. This would be an area he was very familiar with, an area that he probably played in as a child, and it's an area that he can find readily. It has practical reasons. It has a tree, it has a signpost, and it can be found easily. And he'd want that, because he'd want to be able to control these corpses. Even though they were not alive, he wants access. He wants to feel that he can actually be part of this area, and they are part of this area. This is his private graveyard.
With Rena out of the way, Fred was free to marry, and he and Rose cemented their murderous relationship in the January of 1972. They moved across the park from Midland Road and into a street that was set to become infamous.
25 Cromwell Street became the most famous address in the world. It is bedsit land. It's inhabited by a moving population of sort of people who are drifting around, or they've left home for some reason, or they couldn't easily be traced. And that was one of the reasons why Fred remained undetected for so many years.
This anonymous neighbourhood provided the perfect cover for the West's lustful and murderous nature. It was the ideal lair into which they trapped their prey. Fred and Rose now set about spinning their web.
Fred, on his own, was a charmer, and he would try and chat people upon street corners or bus stops or what have you. But having Rose around and having a vehicle completely puts people at ease. And you can see that they slowly but surely crafted this into a refined, scavenging, predatory, stalking, family sort of unit that could, as it were, take people off the streets very, very efficiently.
In November 1972, 17-year-old Caroline Owens was hitchhiking from Tewkesbury to her home in Cinderford. She'd been on a regular visit to see her boyfriend and was waiting for her usual lift from a friendly telephone engineer. It was then that a grey Ford car drew up and a young couple offered her a lift.
She seemed pretty cheerful. She said, "Where are you going to?" And I said, "Cinderford." And she said, "We're from Gloucester, but don't worry, we'll take you all the way back." They started telling me about their family and asked me if I'd like to be a nanny, because they said they had 3 little girls at home. And I was really excited, because I'd always dreamt of being a children's nanny. I love children. Everything seemed quite romantic and glamorous to me. I was going to escape my home and go and live with this lovely family, and it was like a big fairy tale. Within a week of meeting them, I moved in.
But Caroline's fairy tale began to turn into a nightmare when Fred let slip a shocking revelation.
One day, he turned around and he said that Anne-Marie had lost her virginity. And she was a little girl of 8. And I didn't think that was a funny thing to say. And I just said to him quite accusingly, "What do you mean? Why are you saying she's lost her virginity? What's happened to her?" And he said, she had an accident on her push bike and the saddle came off and it penetrated her and she was damaged by that. I became a bit aware then. I'd been sexually abused as a child myself. So it was almost like I could now recognise that her behaviour was probably being beaten up by her stepmother and being abused maybe by her father.
Events got out of hand when Fred propositioned Caroline.
He said, "We've got a sex circle, it's me and Rose and a few other men. We'd like you to join it." And I started getting quite angry, because by this time I got a bit fed up of all the things he used to come out with. And I said, "I don't know what you're on about, don't want nothing to do with it."
A disgusted Caroline fled the house, vowing never to return. A couple of months later, she was standing in her usual hitchhiking spot when she noticed a familiar car.
My first instinct was to run away, but I didn't. And when they pulled up beside me, Rose was apologising. "I'm sorry that you left and the children are really missing you. Can we give you a lift home?" And as much as I didn't want to, I felt like I couldn't be nasty to them, so I got in the car. Everything was fine. We went just through Gloucester. Most of it was like the children had missed me, that kind of conversation. As soon as we got out of Gloucester, going more towards where I live, Fred said to me, "Have you had sex tonight, Caroline?" And I went, "No." And I was kind of like going, "Oh, don't start that kind of conversation off again." And he said, "Oh, go on, have a feel, Rose, see if she's wet." And with that, she just grabbed her hand down my crotch. We started fighting about 2 miles outside of Gloucester, past the roundabout. Fred pulled his car up on the side and helped Rose by turning around in his seat and punched me in the side of the head until I was unconscious. When I came round, Fred had the door open, he was on his knees. He'd already tied my hands behind my back with my scarf, and he was wrapping parcel tape all the way round and round and round my face as a gag. And they turned the car around and they went back around the roundabout and took me to Cromwell Street.
They eventually arrived at the house. Caroline, still bound and gagged, was taken into a bedroom.
For the next 12 hours, I was beaten. Both of them were like medical examining. It was almost, they were talking about my genitalia and all that as if they were doctors. This is a bit strange, oh, that's so-and-so. I thought they were going to get a knife and just start cutting at me. So I was absolutely terrified, but he got his belt off his jeans and he'd folded it over and was whipping me between the leg with his belt. And then she started doing something else sexual towards me while he watched, and then she invited him to join in, and she was doing something to me and he was having sex with her from behind at the same time. To be quite honest, at that time I would have been happier off dead.
After a night of harrowing abuse, a terrified Caroline was eventually left alone with Fred.
I thought he was just going to take me down to the cellar, but he obviously had second thoughts. He just raped me, and then he started crying. He said to me, if you promise that you won't tell her I've touched you, he said, and you'll come back here to live, he said, I'll let you go. And of course, considering I thought I was on my way down to the cellar, I was just so relieved, and I said, yeah, okay, I'll do that.
Caroline had a remarkable escape and went straight to the police. But for Fred and Rose, this signalled a significant change in the balance of their relationship.
I think the escape of Caroline Owen owed a lot to the fact that Fred and Rose were still experimenting with sexuality. Now, Fred had already picked up, or at least imposed on the relationship, something that he carried forward from his mother. The idea that it was okay to engage in things if mother approved, but outside of what mother approved, it was grab and try and get away with as best you could and make sure she didn't find out. The same applied to Rose exactly. Rose dictated what went on as far as Fred's sexual adventures were concerned, and hence most of his actual activities, sexual activities with other people, were hidden from Rose.
The Wests pleaded guilty to the kidnap and sexual assault of Caroline, with their victim too scared to give evidence. Fred and Rose were never charged with rape. Fined £25 each, they were allowed to go free.
I think the £25 fines sent a very clear message that even if you do slip up and you make a mistake, that you're really not going to carry the can fully for what you've done. So it sent the signal that providing you make sure that you tidy up, you probably will never get caught. And that just basically sealed the fate of future victims.
By then they're hooked on this. It becomes like a drug, and then the more you have, the more you need. They have to make a cold-blooded decision. If we do this again, we can't allow somebody to go away because they'll go to the police and they'll come back again. We have to dispose of the bodies. And Fred already knew about disposing of bodies because he'd done it before.
Some, but not all, future victims would conveniently come from society's margins.
Fred West would have realised that there are plenty of people around who will not be missed. They use the same technique actually as certain religious groups that go around finding vulnerable people.
They were very good at beginning to spot the kind of girl who would fall into a category that we kind of use the phrase less than dead. In other words, someone, if they were killed, disappeared, they would probably be less missed, less noticed, and a lot less police fuss than the average person, such as prostitutes, runaways, girls of very sort of mixed repute, who did not have very strong family ties.
Once Fred and Rose had selected their prey, they would take them back to Cromwell Street and down into the cellar.
The events in the cellar, in the, as it were, the Chamber of Horrors,
can be only really speculated on, but by bits and pieces that were left over, clearly a certain amount of sexual torture and abuse had progressed. These victims may have been stripped and hung and left for long periods of time in extreme pain. You have to remember that Fred at least had very little restraint when it came to the revulsion of what his physical acts were. So, you know, to actually inflict almost intolerable, continuous and protracted pain and injury on a person would not have created the same revulsion that it does in you or I.
Fred fitted a beam across and there were hooks on it. He talked about girls being hung there for days and bodies mummifying. We don't know exactly what happens. We do know that in the course of the time that they were there, they were killed. Their bodies were dismembered and they were buried. And then when he had filled the cellar with girls, he concreted over the floor and then turned the cellar into the bedroom for his children.
Fred and Rose West had now perfected their mode of operation, and over the next 14 years would kidnap, rape, torture and murder almost at will. But each murder would require them to push the boundaries of sadosexual behaviour further and further.
She had to be abusive. She had to be in control of the situation. And for Fred, there had to be, as it were, bizarre episodes of sadism and bondage, etc.
They always wanted something more. They want to scream a little bit more. They want to cut a bit deeper. They know what causes more pain than something else. And to be bound and gagged and poked and stabbed and cut and beaten and sexually abused, probably just not even seeing what was going on half the time. With them, these two monsters cackling and laughing, it was the most terrifying experiences beyond human comprehension.
Fred and Rose were now sinking to such depths of depravity that it was entirely possible that one of them could end up as the next victim.
I think there must have been an absolute element of competition between them that grew up in terms of the other person may kill me. Therefore, I am at risk. Therefore, I must show myself to be as tough, as sadistic, as hard, and as progressively homicidal as the other person. Otherwise, you know, I might be the next victim, as it were, rather than the next perpetrator.
By June of 1987, Fred and Rose's eldest daughter, Heather, was 16. She'd suffered both physical and sexual abuse at the hands of her parents all her life, and now this teenage girl was becoming a problem.
She was murdered one day when the other children had gone to school. There's no evidence or belief that she was sexually abused. She was simply murdered and her body was got rid of in the classic Fred West way and buried under what subsequently became a patio.
I don't think for one moment he would have even shed a tear. I think that's how cold-blooded this man was. He was disposing, again, of something that he had no further use for.
If Heather had been able to survive and continue, she may have brought the whole facade down one way or another, and that could not be allowed. So to some degree, they committed, as it were, a very risky murder, a murder that was done to show that they were in control to the rest of their children, and unfortunately that probably led to their undoing.
Heather lay undiscovered under the patio in the garden of Cromwell Street for 8 years. Yet the Wests became careless, and her disappearance had become the subject of a sick joke.
Fred and Rose would tell the children, you know, to behave themselves, otherwise they'd end up under the patio like Heather, which was a macabre joke, you know, obviously looking at the reality of the situation.
The persistent rumours about Heather eventually reached the ears of a local policewoman.
Detective Constable Hazel Savage had always been aware that there were these rumours and persuaded her bosses that that patio was going to have to be dug up.
On the morning of the 24th of February 1994, a police search team knocked at the door of 25 Cromwell Street and set in motion an investigation that would stun the world. The murderous career of Fred West was about to come to an end. As the police started digging in the back garden of 25 Cromwell Street, they could have no idea of what they were about to find. Fred and Rose West's daughter Heather had been missing since 1987, and she was the focus of their search. When they unearthed a female thigh bone, they were confident they'd found what they were looking for. But it fell to pathologist Bernard Knight to break the news to Detective Superintendent John Bennett that there may be more than one body under the patio.
And I still remember John Bennett's face when I got down this hole in the garden and looked up and said, either you've got more than one or she had 3 legs, because there were another 2 thigh bones. I think gobsmacked would fit John's face fairly well at that time, because, say, they expected to find Heather. And then I think there were 3 bodies in the backyard. And then, what was it, 6 in the house?
Fred West was arrested. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he seemed remarkably unperturbed.
He's a 54-year-old man then, he's had a long run. He's got away with it all his life. His mindset is one of, you know, I'm probably caught, but who gives a damn now? Believing it and not believing it at the same time. Not really fully appreciating the enormity of what happened. And it probably took a few weeks before the penny dropped.
He probably, went to pick up his coat a few times, thinking he was probably on his way home in a few days because, they found them now and it's not really that important. So therefore, he was actually entering quite a severe sort of state of delusion, where he actually didn't think, that this was that important.
Despite West's ambivalence to his crimes, he knew the game was up. He offered to show the police where to dig.
He went back to the house and he did indicate certain places where the police might dig in the garden. But he never admitted that there were 6 other bodies under the house. And there was speculation that Fred didn't want to point that out because he was very proud of his house and how he'd built it and incorporated various interesting features into it. He didn't think the police would go as far as knocking the house down in order to find evidence.
But the police did knock the house down, and after recovering a total of 9 bodies from Cromwell Street, they switched their interest to Midland Road, where the body of 8-year-old Charmaine was discovered. A lengthier search of the 2 fields at Much Marcle was to drag on for months, but they were to give up the remains of Rena Costello and Anna McFall. The police now faced the harrowing task of identifying all the victims. Professor Bernard Knight made the startling discovery that the skeletons were incomplete.
There's a lot of hand and toe bones missing, but you actually rarely find every bone if you dig up a skeleton. One reason why there may be a sinister aspect is that 2 babies, 2 fetuses present, and their tiny little bones were there, most of them, even tiny rib bones, size of a matchstick. And yet there were bigger bones missing from the adults. There's 1 shoulder blade missing. Now, it's a bit difficult to imagine how, if you can get a tiny fetal bone surviving, where's this big shoulder blade gone? Of course, the sensational aspect or explanation would be that they were taken off as some form of fetish, and even cannibalism was mentioned, but I think that's pure speculation. But certainly a lot of bones missing.
He may have had some bizarre paranoid ideation, so in the beginning perhaps he was cutting up bodies to make them smaller, taking away the fingers and toes in case they were identified. It could have been, a paranoid state that was superstitious. He had to keep these various little objects close to him so that he knew that he was safe, that he had some control over these dead victims. It may have become a very habitual thing.
It is known for psychopathic killers to keep trophies of their victims. He may have kept 1 or 2 bones as kind of mementos in order to be able to keep his work with him.
On June the 30th, 1994, Fred and Rose West appeared at Gloucester Magistrates' Court, jointly charged with 9 murders. It was 4 months since the police had started digging. Their victims had now been identified as Linda Goff, Lucy Partington, Carol Cooper, Juanita Mott, Shirley Hubbard, Therese Siegenthaler, Alison Chambers, Shirley Ann Robinson, and Heather West. Fred was also charged with a further 2 murders, that of his first wife, Catherine Costello, and his stepdaughter, Charmaine West. Anna McFall, Fred's first victim, was yet to be identified. This was the first time Fred and Rose had seen each other since their arrest. Fred was devastated when Rose rejected him in court.
He would have been distraught. The confidence would have gone. His face would have sagged. He would have lost that confident, jovial demeanour. And he had very little else left to live for.
6 months later, on New Year's Day 1995, whilst waiting to stand trial at Winston Green Prison in Birmingham, Fred West hanged himself.
When they told me he killed himself, and they were saying, oh, that's justice, isn't it? And I said, no, it's not really. And I was absolutely gutted. I wanted him to pay the proper price. And he just, took his own way out and had his own way about what happened to him. He was in control right to the end.
Rose was now left alone to face trial for 10 murders.
She was probably in a bit of a state of shock, actually, I would say. This blanket denial came down, and that's pretty well, on the whole, the way it remained.
Rose, at that point, is only really protecting one person, herself, and that would be her only interest. So she would then progressively try to look as though she was a useful member of society, potentially okay, that it wasn't really her, even if the evidence was against her, and that she wasn't that complicit in what went on.
But the court thought otherwise, and she was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. The investigation was now closed, but had the police found all the victims? Rumours persist of many more bodies.
We have to regard the kind of dark matter of Fred's life and his kind of killing career, if you like. That there are a lot of black spots, which I'm sure may be filled with other poor unfortunates who have disappeared and not been registered and not been connected with the Wests.
There was a young child supposedly killed accidentally when Fred was driving an ice cream lorry in Glasgow. There was a young boy who supposedly committed suicide not far from Gloucester. But really, if that had been more carefully investigated, I think they would have been interested to talk to Fred.
It is possible, as we know with personality disordered individuals, that their characteristics, both Fred and Rose, would have eased off, and perhaps their interest in this would have slowed a little as they approached middle age, and as it were, they were going into sort of homicidal retirement. But the chances are there would be other victims, but unfortunately, due to the logistics, we will probably never know.
25 Cromwell Street was demolished in an attempt to erase the memory of West's atrocities. For Caroline Owens, forgetting her ordeal will not be so easy.
They've took it all down now and turned it into this walkway. Some people wanted a garden of remembrance, but others thought it wouldn't be respected as such. So they decided to turn it into a walkway. And now I'm actually walking where the house was. And some of the girls would have been buried under this area here. And some in the patio over in that area. Brings back quite a few sad feelings, bad feelings for me. I don't like being here. I just see it as a grave for all the girls, and I'm just glad it's all over and they're all out of here. It's almost like you can hear him having his laugh. You can hear him laughing. It's almost him laughing and joking about the patio and stuff. Yeah. It feels like he's still here. I don't think they took enough of this place away. Yeah.
Fred West committed some of the most evil and heinous crimes in history, a gruesome and disturbing legacy. But was he really born to kill?
Given his basic biological background, at birth, this chap was not going to escape the genetics, the psychopathy, which probably affected his brother as well. He was not going to escape the family environment, which was going to reaffirm these characteristics that were already in the parents. You have to look back and say, basically, that his crimes, to some degree, were inevitable. The degree and the frequent nature of the crimes may have been adjusted by aspects of his life, but indeed Fred was born with the characteristics that would make it reasonably easy for him to turn into a killer.
I can't understand you. I ask you to start filming from the feet slowly up to the head. And you go, sit, but sit, pan. Bloody hell, don't you ever watch movies? You must see thousands of movies. You must know what it's like. They're training chimpanzees at Cape Canaveral to operate a camera. Anybody can do it.
These are the home movies of a murderer.
Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
A man who in the 1980s would be uncovered as the most prolific serial killer in British history.
And you ain't seen nothing yet.
A civil servant whose extraordinary behaviour would see him named with cruel irony, the kindly killer.
Batteries had run out. That's why the camera went up the creek. Okay, fair enough. If you think you know how to use it, all you do is point a damn thing and press a button.
But was this murderer of young men driven by nature or nurture? Was the kindly killer born to kill?
Cut.
In the early winter of 1983, we had a problem arise in the Muswell Hill area of London. It was initiated by us receiving a call for a block toilet.
Number 23, Cranley Gardens, had been split into flats and bedsits. The residents had experienced problems with the plumbing for days.
An engineer at the time went to attend the block toilet, cleared the toilet, but did remark to us afterwards that he'd never smelt such a bad smell in an apartment before in his life.
Still, lavatories at the property continued to block.
A plumber was sent around very urgently on Saturday morning, and he looked down in the drains beneath the house, and he saw what he knew was not what should be there.
He observed what he said looked like some butcher's prepared meat and a few bones.
He discovered that what was blocking the toilets was actually human flesh.
On the 9th of February 1983, sitting in my office, minding my own business, and suddenly got a phone call from Peter Slade, who was the early turn uniform inspector, and he asked me if I'd go up to Cranley Gardens. He had a bit of a problem up there, and I just got into the CID car and drove up there. I always remember it was bitterly cold. It had been snowing, and we stood outside this awful house and looked down the pit where the drains were, and he showed me 4 little pieces of flesh, each about 3 inches by half an inch, maybe an inch, and also 3 bones with a knuckle at each end. And my first thought when I saw them was that they were from a human hand. The drains were blocked over halfway up the building, so we knew that the blockage was originating from the very top.
The tenant of the top flat was a 37-year-old executive officer at a nearby job centre, Dennis Andrew Nilsen. He was due to return from work at 5:30.
When my two colleagues and I walked up to the front door of the place in order to wait for him inside, we had no idea what we were going to find. We knew we had a killer, but we didn't know what he'd done. Nilsen walked in, bang on cue at 5:30, and leading up to that, I had been thinking for 2 or 3 hours about what I was going to face. I knew that for someone to have flushed a dead body down the loo in small pieces, it was going to be somebody a little bit different. When Nilsen came in through that front door, I'd already made a decision to be very light-hearted with him. And I remember saying to him, "Mr. Nilsen," and he said, "Yes, that's me." And I said, "I'm Detective Chief Inspector J. I've come about your drains." And a little smile came across his face, and he said, "Well, since when have police been interested in blocked drains?" And I said to him, "Well, you take me up in your flat and I'll tell you all about it." The first thing that caught me was the smell of decomposing flesh. I said to him, "I'm here because your drains were blocked with human remains." And he said, "Oh my God, how awful." And I just got a little bit closer to him, face to face, looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Don't mess me about. Where's the rest of the body?" And he just paused momentarily and he said, "In plastic bags in the other room."
Nilsen was immediately arrested and taken to the station for questioning.
My deputy, Detective Inspector Steve McCusker, sat in the back of the police car and I drove. And I don't know what prompted Steve to do this, but he suddenly said to Nilsen, "Are we talking about one body here or maybe two?" And Nilsen said neither. He said, "I think it's 16. Well, I can remember the steering wheel in the car sort of shaking in my hands.
The police hardly could believe their ears because this was all said in a very matter-of-fact voice, very dispassionate. Why dispassionate? Because this is a man without passion. His only passion came when he was in a murderous impulse, when he was overtaken by the other self.
In Nilsen's wardrobes were 2 black plastic bags and several air fresheners. The bags contained dismembered body parts and 2 severed heads. In a tea chest was found another torso, bones and a skull. Under a drawer in the bathroom were legs and a pelvis. It constituted the remains of 3 men. In the garden of an address in Cricklewood, investigators would identify the fragmented remains of at least 8 more.
He told me off the record that if it hadn't have been 15, it would have been 150 if we hadn't caught him when we did, because there was no stopping. The whole thing was just totally bizarre.
Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Fraserburgh, a remote fishing community in northeast Scotland. His mother's family had lived there for generations. His father was a visiting Norwegian soldier.
He was one of 3 children, the middle child. He had an older brother, a younger sister. He never really knew his father.
Nilsen, as a child, was a bit of a loner.
He didn't really have friends because everybody thought he was a bit odd. His mother said she could never cuddle him. He didn't have tactile relationships with anyone except his grandfather.
Nilsen's father is absent from the household, and so he had formed a bond with his grandfather. They would walk together, fish together, and so forth.
The boy's grandfather would often be away for weeks at a time, trawling the fishing grounds of the North Sea.
One day, he came home from school, and his mother said to him, "Oh, do you want to see your granddad?" He said, oh, he didn't know he was there even. So he was very pleased about that, and he went into the kitchen, and there on the kitchen table was a long box, and in it was his grandfather. Nobody had prepared him for the fact that he was dead.
Nilsen's grandfather had died at sea, and his corpse had been brought home for burial.
He had this picture in his mind imprinted of seeing his grandfather white as a sheet, and I think that affected him deeply.
Nilsen would later say that when he saw his grandfather laid out in the front sitting room after his grandfather's death, that this was when Nilsen first began to associate love with death, an inert body.
From that moment, I'm convinced, I can't prove it, but I'm convinced that his idea of love and his idea of death fused and became linked, inextricably linked. When his mother said to him, "Your granddad's gone to a better place," he, the little boy, aged 6, thought, well, if he's gone to a better place, why didn't he take me with him? He would sometimes even go out into the sea and simulate drowning as a means of being with him.
Aged 15, Nilsen would leave his home behind.
Nilsen would join the army. Specifically, he joined the catering corps, which is, of course, where he'd learn his butchering skills. Skills that were going to be put to use in a different context when he's back in civilian life.
In 1983, the discovery of human flesh blocking the drains at 23 Cranley Gardens had led to the arrest of civil servant Dennis Nilsen. He claimed to have taken the lives of at least 15 young men. Investigators learned that he'd had a lonely childhood, punctuated by the death of a beloved grandfather. At 15 years old, he joined the Army Catering Corps. Early on, the young Nilsen would stand out from his fellow new recruits.
He was quite argumentative in as much as not picking an argument in a nasty sort of way, but if you said that photograph is black and white, you'd know he was saying it was white and black, and so forth. He was quite contrary as a person, really. We used to sit listening to the Beatles, Rolling Stones. We'd read the Parade magazines, which are like girly magazines of the day, and he'd probably be reading broadsheets, and he'd also listen to classical music. I remember there was once a scrap in the barrack room, and I think he scratched and slapped. He didn't thump like the rest of us. I remember somebody saying, "Oh, you're Nilsen, you're weird."
The teenage Nilsen harboured a secret.
What's interesting about the army experience is that it would have been impossible for Nilsen to have shared the fact that he was gay with any of his colleagues.
Basically, they just didn't accept homosexuals at all. So if somebody was gay, they'd keep very, very quiet about it.
During his time in the army, Nilsen began a lifelong interest in photography.
He maintained it was his hobby, photography, but it was much more important than a hobby. It was self-realization. He used to get his colleagues in the army to pretend that they were corpses, as if they'd been slain in battle, and he would take photographs of that. They thought this was a bit odd, but they went along with it.
Nilsen would spend 11 years in the Armed Forces Catering Corps, rising to the rank of corporal.
I think he was a bit of a bully underneath, but with his rank, you know, once he was in charge of a room sort of thing, I think he tended to bully a bit.
But just before his 27th birthday, Nilsen would reject the familiarity and order of army life and strike out on his own. In 1970s London, he found a thriving gay scene.
He's living in a large urban metropolitan area where clearly there are gay pubs that he would be able to visit for the first time.
People were more friendlier back then. People were very chatty, and life in London was exciting at that time. He wasn't a bad-looking man, and he seemed quite educated, quite good to talk to.
He chooses his words well, fluently, but after a few minutes you'd realise that he's not talking to you or with you, but he's talking to himself, because he doesn't pay attention to anything except what he himself is saying.
What are you doing switching the bloody thing on and off for? You'd never make a cameraman, you know. No. I'm not going to do anything pornographic.
Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police.
This is not unusual for these individuals to seek out a profession of authority, whether it's a police officer or some other civil servant type job where they could have control over someone else. This is what is so stimulating to them.
He's living a double life. He's living a life of the police constable, but at the same time, he's also living a double life, talking about being able to express his sexuality. And of course, that inevitably would lead to conflict.
After 11 months, Nilsen tired of the police and quit. He was also becoming disillusioned with the transient nature of the gay scene and began to seek more permanent companionship.
What he was looking for was a relationship, somebody to share his life with.
You didn't go out to find companionship in a club. You just went out to pick up. That was what generally people did. They weren't there for an affair or a relationship. They just wanted a one-night stand.
He got a job with Manpower Services in the heart of the West End. But the opinionated young Scot struggled to bond with anyone.
He's not somebody who's going to make friends very easily. He's not somebody who's going to be the life and soul of the party. He's far too self-centred. He's far too self-obsessed.
But harassed commuter, harassed London tenant being screwed by the Department of Employment, London Transport, big chain stores, supermarkets. Can you, cut there, let me think.
So he's got this quite isolated existence in which he finds it difficult to make friends, in which it's very difficult for him to socialise in any normal way, and that isolation would mean that he would return to his home and lose himself in alcohol. He was a drunk, frankly. I'm not sure he was alcoholic, but he did like to get drunk.
Beer I cannot stand, I got it for free at the bottle party. No.
And he would listen intently to music.
Nilsen was more at ease with machines and objects than he was with people. So music was a way of controlling what was being heard. You can't control a person, you can't control what he's going to say and how he's going to react and how he's going to respond, but you can control the record player.
Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson.
In 1976, Nilsen meets a young drifter called David Gallishan. Gallishan is unemployed and living in a hostel. And although they're seemingly unsuited, Nilsen seeks out a flat for them both to set up home together.
Yeah, okay, come in a minute. I got to sign on.
Oh yeah, I'm going to sign on today. I'll sign on again.
Where's that bloody dog? It's been chewing my slippers again.
Here it is. Chewing your slippers, so give it.
I'll wring its bloody neck if I catch it again.
Melrose Avenue was a very old kind of building. It had lots of furniture in it that lots of had been bought during the war, really. It was quite old. The carpets weren't very nice, and it was quite a run-down building.
1:10 last night, son asleep, twink over there, me here. What happens? Crash, bang, what? Have a look, move the camera up there, have a look at that. Right, look at the state of that. Whole bloody ceiling falls down. Falls down on me for a start, rips straight across, hits the dog, poor old Pooch, budgie goes up, big row, that wakes you up as well. Great chunks. Bloody great chunks of masonry. I mean, you could kill somebody. Listen to that.
They had French windows which led into a garden. Nobody from upstairs could get into the garden. Only he had the entrance through the French windows.
You're a big nincompoop. Oi, over here.
Over here?
Over here, stand up.
How long do you think it'd take me to dig the garden?
Don't stand there with your hand on your hip, be like a big poof.
But Nilsen's overpowering and controlling nature would drive a wedge between the companions.
Find everything.
Oh, come on, where's my bloody tea then?
Well, tea? Oh, it is.
David Gallishan walked out on him after about 18 months. And that really hurt Nilsen, I'm sure it did.
He was essentially a lonely man by virtue of the fact that he bored everyone and they all left him.
So the thing he's searching for is companionship, a relationship, and it's the one thing that psychologically, sociologically, he's not set up to be able to do.
You're a great pillock, Twinkle.
And then he used to invite more and more people back, hoping that someone would stay.
He did ask me to move in, but I said, I don't think I can put up with you in the bottle. The bottle comes between us, it's too much of it. You've got to stop that. If you stopped it, you'd be a lovely, decent guy to live with. But he couldn't stop that. He couldn't stop that. He seemed to be very into himself. It was all him, him, him. He never hardly asked anything about me.
Anything good you find in this kitchen is probably attributed to my having purchased it in the first place. Bloody light doesn't even go on. Can you go back a bit? I mean, you're far too near.
The lonely Nilsen increasingly took refuge in his morbid private fantasies.
He used to lie on the floor in front of a mirror and put glue on his lips and make his eyes look bloodshot. And he got satisfaction out of regarding himself in the mirror in that way. Not, I don't think, an emotional satisfaction, but a deep requirement of his nature, which was obviously perverted.
He would make out he'd passed out and would fall to the floor. You know, and you go rushing up to him and he'd just be laying there. But I actually know that he wasn't asleep. He wasn't out. He wasn't passed out. He was awake. And he would stay there and he would stay there and you'd sit down, you could cook a meal, you could watch television, he'd still be there. But I know that he wasn't asleep. You just know. And it would be in this position of a kind of arms outstretched position. I believe he was pretending to be dead.
All the while, Nilsen continued to play the role of the unremarkable civil servant.
He gets up in the morning, he's a civil servant, he goes to work, he comes home at night. He tends his garden, he cooks for himself, he has a dog which he calls Bleep.
Bleep, come on. Woof, woof, woof. Come on, Bleep, say something.
So there's a sense in which these are the banality, the ordinariness of suburban life.
Ooh, ah, bloody finger, you great pillock.
But of course, Nilsen doesn't really have a sense of how an ordinary life is actually what most people experience, because Nilsen wants to be extraordinary.
On New Year's Day, 1979, 33-year-old Dennis Nilsen woke up next to a teenager he'd met in a pub the night before. The lonely Manpower Services employee later claimed he couldn't face the thought of the sleeping boy leaving.
There came a moment when the murderous impulse to keep this man, not to let him go, overtook him.
Nilsen took a tie, wrapped it around the boy's neck, and pulled.
He was astonished at his strength. At the moment of the murder, he was amazed at how strong he was, because he was not normally a very strong man. Once the murder had occurred and Nilsen had before him a corpse, he then, in a very peculiar fashion, looked after the corpse.
Now, for the first time, Dennis Nilsen had the means to live out his darkest and most secret fantasies.
He would run a bath, he would bathe it, clean it, he would then make it comfortable, he would dry it, put it into the bed, put it into an armchair.
Nilsen lived with the corpse for a week. He then placed the naked body under the floorboards, where it remained for almost 8 months.
If you have this body, you have to find some way to get rid of it, and you certainly don't want it to be identified as quickly as you possibly can.
Nilsen was efficient. He couldn't relate to a person emotionally, but he could relate to a corpse as something that had to be disposed of. It was a problem that had to be solved. That's much easier than dealing with people and their emotions.
Nilsen's garden would provide the solution.
He burned his body in the garden of Melrose Avenue, obliterating him and spreading his ashes to the four winds.
It was not until 2005 that the victim would be identified as 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. His murder would prove to be merely the beginning.
I think the first murder that any serial killer commits is always the revealing murder. He enjoyed doing it, and I think it's that enjoyment that he got from that first murder that propelled him to kill again and again and again.
Well, this is Soho, and the heart of Soho, Old Compton Street. And this is the area that Nilsen used to favour. He'd come out in his spare time to this kind of area and to gay pubs in particular, in order to make contact with people. So he had contact with a lot of youngsters who were coming to London thinking the streets were paved with gold, and who were probably no fixed abode, may have run away from home, dropouts, that kind of person.
The people that Nilsen went to meet were people he instinctively, with an uncanny knack, recognized as people who were lonely and would be most likely to accept an invitation to go home.
Often there is no record of these people being reported as missing, and therefore he's tackling a particularly vulnerable group that many other serial killers target.
While living at Melrose Avenue, Dennis Nilsen would pick up and strangle to death a further 11 young men.
If you strangle someone, you feel it, you can touch it. You just grab whatever's at hand and pull.
I have always suspected that Nilsen would strangle the people that he really didn't want to go at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning, the ones that he wanted to stay, the ones he didn't particularly want to be with, They just go at the end of the night.
That may be true to some extent, but I would look at it in a very different way. I would say that he wanted the bodies to be there because it assured him how in control he was of other people. This is what is arousing to an individual like Nilsen, to be in complete control and domination of others.
Nilsen used the bodies of his victims sexually and in other ways. Nilsen wanted to stay close to these bodies, almost as if they were a form of trophy. He wants to express his power, his complete and utter domination of these young men, even after they're dead.
After he killed them, he would sometimes bring them out and put them in a chair and have conversations with them as if they were still alive.
They can watch television with him. He can talk to them.
He even would go so far as to come home from work and find the corpse sitting in the same armchair that he'd left him in that morning and saying to him, guess what happened to me today? So this was a substitute for real human company.
Nilsen is so self-obsessed, so desperate for his opinion to be the only opinion that counts and matters, he finds it easier to relate, to have a conversation with a dead young man who isn't capable of answering back.
He would then keep the corpse for quite a few days until they became unbearable. He would eviscerate them. He would put into the garden the spleen and stuff which might be proved impossible to live with, and then put what was left of the corpse under the floorboards.
An obsessive-compulsive personality where somebody is attuned to details and orderliness and so on is very common in prolific serial killers because that personality trait will help them elude law enforcement. They're aware of forensic evidence, they'll clean things up meticulously, and so on.
Ultimately, the bodies that were serving as Nilsen's companions would become an annoyance to him. They were in the way. He needed to get rid of them for a variety of reasons. Firstly, they'd smell. Also, they were an annoyance to him because he keeps wanting to bring more live young men back to his flat.
I would actually stay there for the night or maybe for the weekend or whatever. All I can say is that the smell from Melrose Avenue, which you put down to dry rot or whatever rising down, I don't know, animal smells, it smelled awful, it really smelled nasty. But nothing other than this really stood out, nothing at all.
With no further room under the floorboards, the decomposing corpses were removed, cut into manageable pieces, and taken into the garden.
In the middle of the night, he would have a huge bonfire in his garden, burning the remains, disguising the smell with rubber tyres.
And the local children came and danced around the bonfire because they thought it was all rather fun, having not the faintest idea what was going on, really.
Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men without arousing suspicion. In 1981, he moved to a new address, where his behavior would become increasingly more bizarre. Between 1979 and 1981, civil servant Dennis Nilsen had murdered and disposed of 12 young men at his flat in Cricklewood. In October of '81, he moved to a rented top-floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, Muswell Hill, where his disturbed fantasies would take a new twist. 21-year-old Carl Stotter met the seemingly kind and friendly Nilsen at the Black Cap in Camden.
He took me back to his place. He was a nice guy. He didn't have murderer tattooed across his face or anything like that. He was nice. And I slept with him.
What he did was, first of all, attack him from behind with a tie and throttled him.
He killed me. He strangled me.
He thought he was dead, but he wasn't.
And then he drowned me in a bath of water.
While he thought he was dead, he got himself a rum and coke and lit another cigarette and said to himself, "Oh my God, here we go again," as if this had been done by somebody else.
He described it as being almost in a trance, that he was doing this act without even realizing that he was doing it. And that's fairly typical. Serial murderers will talk about almost waking up and realizing that, oh my gosh, what are they doing?
When he realized the man was alive, he then got extra blankets out. He rubbed his legs to get the blood circulating properly. He put on an extra fire.
Heart massage, mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He brought me back to life. And I was there for 3 days.
You've got a classic example of Nilsen initially trying to kill, believing he's killed the victim, but then realizing that the young man is actually still alive. And then Nilsen going into Good Samaritan mode, trying to help the young man get better. Nilsen is able to kind of inhabit a kind of parallel universe in which he no longer sees himself as being someone who's doing wrong, but actually can interpret his actions as somebody who's doing good.
He told me that what happened was I got caught up in the sleeping bag set, and that was it. And I believed him, because you don't think that somebody's going to try and kill you. Anyway, he did.
Carl Stotter would not be the only recipient of Nilsen's Good Samaritan Act. At least 3 more young men would be strangled and then allowed to live. The attacks would remain uninvestigated by the police.
Most of the police would say, well, you were in a bondage game and it's your fault, you participated. And the absolute humiliation of saying, oh gosh, I don't want to be known for this kind of behavior really protects the serial murderer.
It appears Nilsen's odd behavior was not only reserved for strangers.
I fell asleep on the floor. I wouldn't get into the bed. I woke up and he was straddled over me. He had what I call an apple knife. But behind him, there was smoke, and there was a gas heater that used to be on the wall, had apparently fallen off. Now, I couldn't possibly have knocked that off with my feet, and it was quite bad. The room was full of smoke, and I said, what's the knife for? He said he was trying to cut it, trying to get it right off the wall in case there was an explosion. And I'm positive that when I went to sleep, that gas fire wouldn't have been on, because he was already asleep, and because it was quite a very mild night. That's all I remember thinking, but then again, thought no more of it. I have to believe that he was going to do something. He was trying to asphyxiate me.
But not everyone would escape with their lives.
With every serial murderer, although they start out slowly, they then become more frenetic, and they will start killing a lot more people a lot more close in time.
The addiction becomes so overwhelming that it's the corpses pile upon one another.
At Cranley Gardens, 3 men would suffer the same fate as the 12 at Melrose Avenue. But unlike his previous residence, Nilsen's top-floor flat had no space under the floorboards.
He would boil their skulls to get all the flesh off, and then he would chop them up into little bits. To him, the people were just about the same and equivalent to the meat he was chopping up in the army. Had absolutely no reason or meaning emotionally to him. It was just something he did.
Half of one was under the bath. Pieces of another were in the wardrobe in black bags.
On the day that I went back there, on the very last day, and he wouldn't let me into the flat. He was in the strangest mood I've ever seen him in. He was completely flustered, and I couldn't understand what was happening. And the dog ran down the stairs, and he said, "Hold the door, but don't go in." And I thought, charming. I thought, I've known you all this time, you won't let me into your flat. I said, he doesn't trust me, obviously. So he brought the dog back up, and he said to me, "You didn't go in." I said, "No, I'm just standing here, aren't I?" And I couldn't work that out.
Nilsen's desperate efforts at disposal would be his undoing. On the 9th of February, blocked drains would lead to his discovery and arrest.
Scotland Yard launched its biggest murder investigation today after a pathologist confirmed that human remains found in a sewer outlet were parts of 3 bodies.
For some strange reason, the minute they said Muswell Hill, they gave no address, they gave nothing. I seem to know that this is him. It's him. I don't know why I would think that. And then an hour later, I was listening more intently, and then they said in Cranley Gardens, and it was the house. Could you stop it a second?
In custody, Nilsen would describe the murder of 15 young men in minute detail.
He saw no reason to get worked up about it. All right, if you've arrested me, so let's get on with it.
Nilsen gave us every bit of information that he could think of. I mean, we interviewed him 16 times over the next few months. Throughout the interviews, Nilsen was totally matter-of-fact, quite cold. There was no remorse, there was no indication of any remorse at all.
In November, Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment. Over a 4-year period, he had taken the lives of 15 young men. But was the so-called kindly killer born to kill?
Dennis Nilsen was clearly born with a gene which was flawed and which was bound to cause problems in one way or another, just as some people are born with a gene which makes them prone to anger or to jealousy. Nobody is born with an inevitability about his future. The future is shaped by the experience. It may shape the gene which is flawed, but that is not the same thing as saying that there is evil inherent. So Nilsen could have turned out to be a completely different person, not a stable person. Because of the inherited gene, he would still be flawed, but he need not have become a murderer. The idea that he was born evil is nonsense.
He was brought up in a relatively banal, ordinary circumstances. There were certain elements of his life which were odd or which were difficult for him to overcome. But the circumstances of his childhood and the trials and tribulations of his childhood were not something that were unique to Dennis Nilsen, but were common to many hundreds of thousands of young people. And if Dennis Nilsen was born to kill, so would those hundreds of thousands of young people who had similar circumstances that they had to deal with when they were growing up. So no, I don't believe that Dennis Nilsen was born to kill.
You can be born with a flaw which you've got to keep under control. If you don't keep it under control, it's your fault.
I don't think he was born to kill, but certain circumstances made him that way. Des was a necrophiliac. He was a control freak. I think if he couldn't get what he wanted from a person, like some nights he couldn't with me, then he would, if he wanted it, and he was drunk and he was in the mood for it, and I mean sex, then he would do something to get it, go out of his way to get it. He would, whatever it took.
I think all of these people are to a large degree born to kill. It's a biopsychosocial problem, but biology, in my judgment, has a very large component. We don't know exactly what the specific biology or neurobiological problem is, whether it's genetic, hormonal, chemical, electrical, brain damage, a combination of factors. But there has to be a number of things to go wrong in order for a serial sexual murderer to be created.
Nilsen himself claimed to have wrestled to find a reason for his crimes.
It amazes me that I have no tears for these victims. I have no tears for myself of those bereaved by my actions. Am I a weak person, constantly under pressure, who just couldn't cope with it and escapes to wreak revenge against society through the haze of a bottle of spirits? Or maybe it's because I was just born an evil man. Self-serving crap. For me, this is just specious nonsense. Self-serving nonsense to try and justify his behavior.
He's nothing. He's a liar. He's taken human lives. I feel sorry for his mother. To give birth to such a monster.
He was kind, thoughtful, friendly.
Pathological liar.
At the time, one would have said an answer to prayer, just what we needed.
Access to death-dealing drugs.
Always well-managed, very polite.
Perfect predator.
Good company outside and extremely popular with everybody.
Trust of the victims.
He was a nice guy. He was a good guy.
Perfect killing machine.
His patients were mainly elderly women living alone and vulnerable. They adored their doctor, Harold Fred Shipman. And even when their contemporaries began dying in unusually high numbers, patients remained loyal. The number of patients that Dr. Shipman murdered is still unknown, but his murderous roll call eclipses the toll of any other serial killer caught to date. Did events in his life turn him to murder? Or more simply, was Harold Shipman born to kill?
Harold Frederick Shipman is an interesting case to examine. The very remarkable nature of his case is the fact that he was not remarkable. We could say he can't be a killer because he's a bit like us. Harold Shipman fitted in with society to a great degree, and this was the very important feature which made it possible for him to go on and on to be one of the most prolific serial killers of all time.
For his victims, death came in the afternoon, but for Harold Frederick Shipman, it came in the early hours of the morning at Wakefield Prison on Tuesday the 13th of January 2004. Prisoner CJ 8199, the expert in death, had timed his final act well. He was beyond saving. He had been alive at 5 a.m. when the last check was made on him, and he knew the next check was not for another hour. As a doctor, he also knew that 4 minutes was the maximum time he needed.
What he has done is he's taken to his grave the reason and the motivation behind his killing, and left everybody guessing in relation to that and sort of perplexed forevermore.
His suicide caused shockwaves through Hyde, the town in Greater Manchester where most of his victims and their families lived.
Hyde was such a lovely town. It was a proper old-fashioned traditional community where sons and daughters still lived on their parents' doorsteps, and they all lived near each other and they all understood each other. It was a very close community with a warm heart. So for Shipman to be able to kill so many people in such a small, safe community was doubly devastating.
Over the years, doctors, funeral directors and even pharmacists had raised suspicions about Dr. Shipman, but such worries were swept under the carpet.
I found out that the police had actually investigated Shipman before in March 1998, quite soon after breaking the story. I spoke to Dr. Linda Reynolds, and she was the GP who courageously went to the local coroner, John Pollard, and told him that she was worried that Shipman had killed his patients.
On that basis, I then instructed the police to make an investigation, and that is what has now been referred to as the failed investigation, because the police came back to me about a fortnight later and said they'd investigated and quite frankly they could find nothing wrong.
The fact is they came back to Dr. Linda Reynolds and told her she was mistaken, that Shipman was a pillar of the community, and she must be careful what she's saying about such people. And Shipman went on to kill 3 more women after that.
Dr. Shipman might have carried on killing for years if it had not been for the suspicious death of Kathleen Grundy on the 24th of June 1998. The last person to see her alive was Dr. Harold Shipman, when he'd gone to her home to take routine blood samples.
When Kathleen Grundy died, she left a will. That will was made out in favour of Dr. Shipman, but her daughter, Angela Woodruff, got this copy of a will, and she was absolutely astonished, because if you look at the actual will, it's so amateur. If you've got a forger will, then you get about 2 out of 10 for forgery. It simply wasn't very good.
Kathleen Grundy's daughter believed that the signature was not actually her mother's, so consequently the document needed to be examined.
The officer who was given the case to handle started talking to a couple of people he knew, one of them being the local undertaker, Alan Massey, who said, well, I've been really worried about the number of cremation certificates. I've mentioned it to people before, they've taken no interest, but there's so many of them.
There was the fact that Shipman's fingerprint appeared on the will, when in actual fact in interview Shipman denied that he'd ever seen the will. The fact that Shipman actually owned the typewriter that the will had been typed on, and that in interview he suggested that Mrs. Grundy used to borrow the typewriter. But he couldn't suggest to us who had returned it to him after the will had been prepared.
It was decided that Kathleen's body needed to be exhumed and forensically examined to discover the true cause of her death.
The investigation into Kathleen Grundy's death was undertaken in the knowledge that there had been an earlier investigation into Dr. Shipman's activities. That had involved 19 deaths. About a fortnight into the inquiry, there was interest from a local newspaper.
My news desk at the Manchester Evening News was tipped off about the death of Kathleen Grundy and the fact the police were investigating her GP. I rang the police and they didn't want to comment any further.
The police decided that the families of the 19 people who died should become aware of the re-investigation before the story broke.
I then went into Hyde to find out more about the case from the people who knew Kathleen Grundy. Almost immediately I bumped into 2 old ladies and they said, "Oh, you mean Dr. Death, dear?" And I said, "I beg your pardon." And they said, "Well, they say he's a good doctor, but you don't last. Lots of old ladies have died with Dr. Shipman."
Family members then told us very similar stories to the story that we had already uncovered in relation to Kathleen Grundy. That is when I started to realise that this was much bigger than one death that Dr. Shipman had been involved in. We carried out the exhumation and a pathologist actually performed a post-mortem. Shipman, of course, had certified the death at the time it had occurred as being old age. He could not confirm the cause of death that Shipman had put and consequently we sent samples off for analysis.
There were levels of diamorphine in the body of the deceased which were sufficient to have led to her death.
Of course, Mrs. Grundy had not been suffering from any serious illnesses that required her to be administered diamorphine.
At that stage, I was totally convinced that they were on to someone here who had committed many heinous crimes.
The community were absolutely wholeheartedly behind Dr. Shipman at this point. He'd groomed that community so that they truly believed in him and thought that he was looking after them, when in fact he was killing them by the hundred.
The kind of victims he picked, the elderly people, are what we call the category of less than dead. In other words, the kind of people that, if they passed away, you don't actually notice so well. They're not the kind of people that are going to cause a big fuss, because almost it's expected. And in fact, counter to most serial killers, he's one of the few people who could probably get the relatives or the council to take away the body for him.
The way in which the victims were found was in itself quite disturbing. Many of them were found fully clothed in the middle of the daytime, often sitting upright in a chair or on a sofa. In some of those cases, Shipman had actually certified on the cremation form that he'd carried out a full external examination of the body, and yet the victim was still sitting there, fully clothed, shoes on, the sleeves buttoned down to the wrist, dresses that buttoned to the neck. Well, how you can carry out a full external investigation in those circumstances, I just don't understand.
Often in the medical notes, which he'd made up, suggesting that these people had had heart conditions, for example, when they hadn't really, and then saying, well, they must have had a heart attack. Of course, somebody having a heart attack doesn't just simply fall asleep sitting in a chair looking very relaxed. Life just isn't like that.
Police investigated Shipman's book of death certificates. They made a list of 15 deaths that they decided should be investigated as a priority. Of the victims on this list, 9 had been buried and 6 cremated. More exhumations were ordered. Police also learned that Dr. Shipman had often encouraged the relatives of his victims towards cremation.
In each of the exhumations that took place, tests were carried out, and in most of those, morphine was discovered in the body, and that led to a prosecution in relation to that death.
The police inquiry would also reveal Shipman's modus operandi. He would often kill his victims, most of whom were elderly, with an injection of morphine, and then return to his office to falsify their medical records on his computer to exaggerate their poor health. In the case of Kathleen Grundy, he had backdated several entries to suggest she had become addicted to morphine.
The thought of an 80-odd-year-old former Lady Mayoress of the town of Hyde scoring bags of heroin in the back streets of Manchester seems to me ludicrous and ridiculous, and a gross insult to her memory, quite frankly.
Being a GP placed Harold Shipman in a position where, in public, he could actually carry out the very activities that in private he wished to carry out, and actually project them in the community and wander around the community and make it quite clear to people that, I am a great doctor.
On the 7th of September 1998, Shipman was arrested on suspicion of murder. Who was the real Dr. Shipman? What made him a monster?
In order to actually find out about this actual behaviour and how it developed, we have to look back in time very closely at his childhood and even beyond.
In September 1998, Harold Shipman was convicted for 15 murders. The Shipman inquiry now documents that he killed 284 people over a period of 30 years before he aroused suspicion. However, no one really knows the true number of his victims. The Shipman case is unusual. There was no highly publicised trail of bodies, no madman on the loose. Until Shipman was arrested in connection with the Kathleen Grundy case, no one could have known just how many murders had taken place.
If we wish to find out whether Harold Shipman was in fact born to kill, we need to examine early childhood, looking for patterns of behaviour which would indicate that they carry traits, that their temperament is different. With Harold, we realise that on the surface, it seems like a very ordinary childhood, a very ordinary background. But if we dig deeper, we know that there are going to be clues as to why he ended up where he did.
Harold Frederick Shipman, nicknamed Fred or Freddie, was born into a working-class family on June the 14th, 1946 in Nottingham. He was a distant and slightly aloof child, maintaining a distance between himself and his contemporaries, mainly due to the influence of his mother, Vera.
I think his mother certainly encouraged him to not the path of righteousness, but she thought Fred was special. She wanted him to be special. And now he was the middle child. The elder sister, Pauline, left school at 15, was no great academic. His brother Clive wasn't as bright, his younger brother. But Fred brought up in a decent and fairly new council estate in Nottingham, passed his 11 plus, got into the local grammar school, High Pavement, which was extremely prestigious. To do so, he studied hard. He didn't mix very much with local kids.
And his parents, like my parents, like lots and lots of other working class parents, would have been so proud. Our boy is going to the grammar school.
Shipman's school days at High Pavement were largely unspectacular. Like so many other grammar school entrants, he went from being one of the bright kids at junior school to being run-of-the-mill amongst so many other clever boys.
Fred was very serious, and I think it may be that he had to work harder than most. And I know he had a real respect for his family, and I think he thought that they'd made an effort, his parents had made perhaps a sacrifice.
His mother really didn't want Fred to be, as it were, in this area, have the same kind of career as other boys. And having him focus exclusively on his studies meant that Fred was not really integrated into the real world. And he was allowed to build up fantasies of power, and fantasies that perhaps might have had a sexual connotation, because Fred was not really allowed to develop socially and sexually normally.
Vera decided who Fred could play with and when. She wanted to distinguish him from other boys. She was more ambitious for Harold than her other children.
Perhaps because he seemed that much mature, he seemed that much older. And when certain incidents occurred at school, which perhaps, had it been anybody else, you'd have had a good laugh and you'd have made him pay for it. With Fred, you didn't. One of the best examples of that is the rugby club dancers that we had. He turned up with his sister, and they used to dance together in this strangely uncoordinated way, totally different. And I think she was taller than him as well. We just respected him. It's strange.
The fact that Fred got respect from his friends is a little bit surprising because of his social alienation. However, by playing it by the rules, by creating an act, Fred just simply coexisted with these people and formed no real problem in relating to other people. So he was able, if it were, as it were, just to slot in. He didn't really have any difficulty because he didn't create any difficulty.
On Friday the 21st of June 1960, when Fred was just 17, his mother Vera died of lung cancer, an illness that he had kept strangely secret from his classmates. The family GP visited the house regularly in the weeks before Vera's death, giving her welcome injections of morphine in ever-decreasing dosages. He met schoolmate Michael Heath on his way to school the following Monday morning, when he told him his tragic news.
Most days, Fred would be coming along the road here from his house, and we would meet at the bottom of the road here, and we'd stop here and just say a few words, and then we'd walk on to the school. And it was on one of those mornings, Monday morning, when I met him at the point just there and just asked him what sort of weekend he's had, and he said, my mum had died. His mum had died, and that's quite a shock, really.
Fred never said anything to me other than once on a bus I seem to remember him saying, my mum's not very well. But that could have been that she'd got a cold.
That must have been terrible. What did you do? How did you cope? And he said, well, I put my gear on, went for a run, and he ran in the pouring rain, so he must have been absolutely saturated.
He grieved in a very strange way. He ran for miles and miles and miles, all through the night, in his school running shorts and T-shirts, and it was quite an amazing thing.
He just seemed the same as he did any other day, but he must have been going through hell for weeks, months before.
Fred would be the one who sat with her and waited for the doctor to come round and to give her an injection of morphine. And he was at her bedside when she died. And that was a moment that obviously impacted on him greatly.
Here's the school gates, what was the school. There's 10 minutes on that particular morning that he told me that his mum had died, but awkward, to say the least. And I must admit, when we arrived, it was a bit of a relief for us to go our own separate ways.
It's interesting that he'd shown no interest in medicine or said he wanted to be a doctor until after his mother passed away.
Many have drawn the comparison between Fred's experience of his mother dying under morphine and his later use of morphine to actually execute the old ladies. Now, there has to be a connection, and very few people have actually drawn why one leads to the other. If you look back in Fred's history, he constantly used exercise. Exercise generates what we call endorphins. Endorphins are extremely powerful opiates, 100, sometimes 1,000 times more powerful than heroin. Now, Fred was accustomed to this, if you like. When his mother passed away, he experienced what many people experience when a family member finally passes away after a grueling period. He felt relief. He felt a certain lifting. And this experience was then compounded because he went out for whatever reason and ran all night. And that extra opiate running around his body will have given Fred a euphoric high. Hence, this situation was likely to be repeated and give him pleasure in the future.
Fred failed to get the grades he needed to study medicine at Leeds Medical School.
Common with many serial killers with lower self-esteem, they always aspire to be better than, they want to be up with their peers. They envy their peers. Kenneth Bianchi, the Hillside Strangler, always wanted to be a cop. Everybody, all his schoolmates were all succeeding round him with good grades. He was a failure. They're always scrabbling to get out, scrabbling to get somewhere.
After resitting his exams the following year, he was eventually accepted into Leeds Medical School in 1965. Did Shipman decide to become a doctor to save people, or to have the power to kill them?
When Shipman first went to Leeds, he regularly got a bus into Leeds every morning, and on that same bus there was a young girl called Primrose Oxtoby, who, like Shipman, had had a rather austere upbringing. She left school at 15 without any qualifications, and she got onto an art and design course at a college in Leeds. And on that bus was they're very good looking at the time, Shipman, and they hit it off. But very quickly after meeting, after about 6 months, she was pregnant. Shipman was careless, reckless for the first time in his life. They got married at a register office. There isn't even a photograph in existence of that wedding.
Shipman qualified from Leeds Medical University and went on to Pontefract General Infirmary to train as a junior doctor. After 12 months, he was duly licensed to practice medicine. According to the Shipman inquiry, this was where his first recorded murder took place.
The Shipman inquiry found that he killed a 4-year-old girl, for example, and she was very, very ill and dying. And her mother left the room saying, please be kind to her. And he took that as his cue to kill her. He might have pretended that that was euthanasia and that he was doing that child a favour. But he wasn't, because that child didn't die in her mother's arms. Her mother was having a cup of tea in the hospital cafe. So I think even then he had a very cruel streak that wanted to end lives, come what may.
It is absolutely uncertain exactly when Harold Shipman began to kill people. It may have been the case of the 4-year-old girl, but we do know that as he approached that time, Harold will have had some swelling and some strangely unexplicable, pleasurable feelings that were probably associated with the event with his mother, and he would suddenly start to feel he was in that powerful role, that controller of life and death. In a way, it harks back to that very moment when he thought he should be that GP by his mother's bedside.
By 1974, he was a father of 2 and had joined a medical practice in the Yorkshire town of Todmorden. In this North English setting, Fred seemed to change character. He became an outgoing, respected member of the community in the eyes of his fellow medics and patients.
But moving into general practice as a junior partner was clearly very attractive, and he went and worked at the Abram Ormerod practice in Todmorden, where there was illness among the partners, and Dr. Michael Grieve welcomed him with open arms.
He was extremely good, almost manic in the way he carried out his duties, and brought us all the latest techniques and kept us very much up to the mark. He was really, at the time, one would have said an answer to prayer, just what we needed. The doctors did not choose their patients. The patients chose the doctor that they liked. And Fred had quite a devoted following who felt that he was the bee's knees and would do the best for them in all circumstances.
Harold Shipman underwent a metamorphosis. He changed from being the very asocial mummy's boy who didn't really get on very well with people into a GP who would establish himself in this area and find that suddenly he could relate to people and grow, if you like, as a pillar of the community. However, Harold Shipman did have a different agenda.
But the staff in the medical offices where he worked saw a different side of the young practitioner.
He wouldn't delegate, he wouldn't let the nurses give injections for him, for instance. He wouldn't let the pathology technicians, when they came out once a week to take blood samples for patients. Now, Fred would insist on doing all these himself.
Nobody had any idea that he was guilty of any kind of malpractice, although it would emerge later in Todmorden that there was an instance where 3 patients of his died in one day. And for a long time, one of them, Eva Lyons, was thought to be his very first victim.
But the village doctor wasn't as perfect as the fellow GPs thought. It was discovered that he had a drug addiction.
One of the other doctors in the practice happened to be in the pharmacist, and she opened the book and said, you should look at this, you know. And there were scores of entries. And he'd amassed huge amounts of pethidine, clearly not for patients, but for himself.
Well, he said he was addicted to pethidine because they were told you shouldn't give your patient anything that you haven't tried yourself. And finding that it sustained him in his manic state, because he was quite manic in what he would do. He'd take on these enormous loads and get through them. And perhaps the pethidine was what enabled him to do it.
And he was told, sorry, Fred, you'll have to go. And he booted his medical bag across the surgery where they sod you then. And off he went.
He thought that I was the devil incarnate. And I never spoke to him again.
It is that point when a serial killer is confronted with the obvious, they retreat. either with the excuse society's fitted me up, it's not my fault, or they explode. And that's what Shipman was basically doing. How dare these little doctors, these little people, these people that are lower than me, how dare they question me, how dare they? Because he believes, he's got this thing, how dare they? These people are much lower than me. My mother's always taught me this way, how dare they interrogate me, who are they?
Shipman was ultimately forced out of the practice and into a York drug rehabilitation centre in 1975. 2 years later, his many convictions for drug offences, prescription fraud and forgery cost him a surprisingly low fine of £600.
After about a year or so, he saw an advert for a junior partner in a practice and hired, and he applied for it. And when he went there, he was totally open about his previous drug habits and said, look, I'm completely clean, I was under enormous stress, the General Medical Council is going to allow me to carry on working as a doctor and I'd love another chance. And they believed him and took him in.
In 1977, he was accepted to practice in the Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, and it was here that he felt free to kill.
You know, Hyde's not a very big town, and obviously we had a shop. We knew lots of people that were Fred's patients, and everybody seemed to have the same opinion that he was a caring guy. You know, he just seemed a normal guy.
Again, he played the role of the dedicated, hard-working and community-minded doctor, highly respected in the area and making many friends.
We went to a couple of social functions with them. They were good company outside and extremely popular with everybody that was there, giving the impression the guy was just a normal guy, you know.
Harold Shipman found it very much more comfortable to kill and be in Hyde. Hyde was a fairly small, naive community where he would be accepted, this, you know, tweed-wearing, friendly, local GP character. Harold Shipman had what we call career development as a killer. He had actually developed as a killer to the stage of being Dr. God.
I think Shipman went into single-handed practice purely to continue killing.
Clearly, if he worked on his own, nobody would know exactly what he was up to.
Most times he was okay, but the odd time he was a bit offish. So, you know, you tend to wonder, what were those days? Were those days maybe when something happened? You don't know. It makes you think.
Because of the nature of the Shipman case, it may never be possible to document the exact number of murders he committed. The number and patterns of deaths in Dr. Shipman's practice was examined. When it was compared with those of other practitioners, significant differences appeared, notably that the rate of deaths of elderly patients was disproportionately high. Other variations appeared. Deaths were often clustered at certain times of the day. Patients' records and previous symptoms were mismatched, and Dr. Shipman was usually in attendance. The question remains, why wasn't he stopped earlier?
In order to ascertain why Harold did what he did, you have to examine those little chinks, those flaws that show a glimmer under the surface of this projection as the good doctor, as the average man.
In this macabre tale, Dr. Shipman's former patients are grateful he was finally stopped. Could they have been next? And there's little doubt that some owe their lives to a determined and intelligent woman named Angela Woodruff. Determination to solve a mystery about her mother's will helped ensure that on Monday, the 31st of January 2000, the jury at Preston Crown Court found Shipman guilty of murdering 15 of his patients and forging the will of Angela's beloved mother, Kathleen Grundy.
It's difficult to believe that we were friends with Fred Shipman, who was one of the biggest serial killers in Great Britain. But when he's such a normal guy,
He just fooled everybody. He shouldn't be playing God anyway. Nobody should be doing that.
Many of his victims lived on their own. A lot of them used to regard his visits to them as being something to look forward to. There were many instances of them being dressed in their best clothes, as if they were getting a visitor and it was something to look forward to, and therefore, you know, let's put on something nice because the doctor's coming to visit.
That was all part of this great power trip that he was on, that their last words would have been, "Thank you, Doctor."
Mistake number 1, Shipman's use of the drug morphine. Morphine is one of the few poisons that can remain in body tissues for centuries.
There are other substances which he could have used which would have been either less traceable or even not traceable at all within the body. Why he chose to use diamorphine, I don't know. One reason might be that he was simply not quite as clever as he thought he was and didn't realise that it would be so traceable so easily. The other reason may be that he actually was quite willing and wanted to be found out at some stage.
Mistake number 2, the typewriter and the badly forged will.
So when Shipman murdered Mrs. Grundy and forged a will, what was happening? Did he want to get caught? Was he looking for a way out or what? Having killed 283 people, when it comes to Catherine Grundy, well, anybody's fair game. He's not been found out so far, even though he most certainly should have been. But the fact is, he was a hospital doctor and a GP who was never challenged.
I was very surprised to see that will and what a mess it was. So I think at that point maybe he wanted to get caught. On the other hand, maybe he felt invincible.
I think that Harold was becoming a little bit paranoid as to whether he was in safe territory, and he was testing the ground to find out whether or not people were suspicious of him, and also to prove to himself that he could talk his way out of this amongst these people that were his intellectual inferiors.
His actual reason for doing it, I'm not sure, I must be honest, I really don't know.
I think he expected to set the world on fire, but instead he faced a series of setbacks. He got Primrose pregnant while he was a medical student. He became addicted to pethidine and was caught. So in the end, he was quite disappointed with what he appeared to be. He was quite small and lowly, quite a small man. And I think that disappointment fueled an anger and an addiction to killing.
Certainly there is grandiosity involved. He acted like a supreme being, a godlike figure who clearly had the power over life and death, and he chose to kill people at a time when he wanted to kill them.
So why did he kill? Some speculate he hated older women, citing comments he made about the elderly being a drain on the health system. Others feel he was recreating his mother's death scene in order to satisfy some deep masochistic need.
I think his mother's death informed the murders, gave him a theme, but I don't think it's the reason. A lot of people lose their mothers when they're teenagers to cruel and painful diseases, and we don't all go out and start killing hundreds of people. I think he had a personality disorder to start with, but the fact that his mother used to wait for him to return from school, sitting in the window with a cup of tea, and the doctor would turn up and give her a morphine, and that was her relief from the terrible pain of the cancer. I think that was very important to him when he did start killing.
The first time that Harold Shipman actually killed someone, it is probable that in his mind there was rising pleasure associated with the incidence of his mother's death. At that point, he will have felt a certain amount of power and control and a certain calmness associated with the euphoria with his mother And this would have been rewarding enough to propel him forward. But I feel that that form of euphoria, in contrast to many other serial killers, would have died out fairly quickly after the incident.
Despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Harold Shipman continued to maintain his innocence and shield the motives of his crime, even in prison.
When Fred first went into prison, my wife started to correspond with him because, you know, she firmly believed that he was innocent. There are round about 25 letters which were written. In all the letters, there's obviously no reference to the fact that he's admitting to anything at all. He was definitely trying to keep as much normality about his actions as he possibly could, so that anything that people might come up with about what he's supposed to have done seemed totally illogical.
He'd been to a house, rolled the sleeve up, administered morphine, killed her. That's what happened, isn't it, Doctor?
No.
Harold always maintained his innocence to me. He never once, as far as I know, to me or any of the other prisoners, admitted to the guilt of actually murdering any of the patients.
The levels were such that this woman actually died from the toxicity of morphine, not as you wrongly diagnosed. In plain speaking, you murdered her.
No.
When Dr. Shipman was finally convicted, my wife was very upset, and I said, well, there's only one thing you can do. I said, you can't write to the guy. I said, I think, you know, judging by the amount of evidence that's been put forward and the time it's taken, I said, I think it's pretty conclusive that he is guilty.
I remember when they first tried charging him for 218 murders on top of what they already accused him of. That was the first time I'd ever actually seen him react to his trial on what was going on. I remember when he came back from court, he just broke down in tears and was explaining to me what had gone on, and he said, they're trying to pin another 218 murders on top of me. I mean, he said, I don't know where it's coming from or where they're getting the evidence from or anything, you know, where they're getting these stories, he used to call them. And that was the first time I'd actually seen a reaction from him. He smashed his cell up, basically. He just went berserk.
Harold Shipman never admitted to his crimes. Not to prison warders, not to prison inmates. Harold Shipman maintained the act that he'd started in childhood, where he, as it were, acted out the role of a social person, where he acted out the role of the good doctor. He could not, at the end of his existence, change that, because if he had admitted that he had done this, he would unpick and undo the fabric of his entire life, which was built on a facade.
In an extraordinary turn of tables, Shipman saved his cellmate's life.
I was so scared of being in a cell with Dr. Shipman because of the reputation. The rest of the prisoners used to saying to me, that's that nutter, he's that doctor that's killed all them patients, like, I mean. I was in fear for my own life. So much I attempted to take my own life myself because I was that much scared, like, I mean. He cut me down and resuscitated me, but after that, we seemed to get on pretty well. If he was so intent on murder, if that was his pleasure, why didn't he leave me to die?
Shipman had a particular victim type with a method of killing them that he was comfortable with in locations, again, either the victim's territory or somewhere where he was in control. The guy he revived was most certainly not sick in the clinical sense. He was not the preferred victim type of Shipman, and I think Shipman probably did then the only decent thing he'd ever did is becoming a doctor. Instead of taking lives, he saved one.
I'm still confused because, like, I can't understand as a man such as Harold, like I say, to me as a friend, how he could have gone about doing it. All those people, I mean, it's not something, I mean, it's not a natural thing, is it, to take human life?
To many of Dr. Shipman's victims, His suicide is a final betrayal. Not only did he kill their loved ones, but he escaped the punishment of spending the rest of his natural life in prison.
I think Fred planned his suicide. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. I think he knew about the fact that Primrose would be financially better off if he died before a certain age.
He made sure Primrose was well looked after, and again, he was winning the game and he was beating the authorities. Not only that, he was taking his secrets to the grave.
I think one of the main issues with regard to Harold Shipman was that he was a doctor. We all learned from a very early age that doctors are to be trusted.
From the evidence we have, the question is, was Harold Shipman born to kill? When we look back at his early life, we see a trait that seems to run through. That trait seems to make him objectify people, stops him feeling the feelings of others in the way that we do and call empathy. He also seems to have prevented him from normal childhood development, to created a world of fantasy, to actually have led and helped certain incidences in his life where he adopted the role of a GP, of a trusted person, who then went on to kill people rather than prolong their lives. Yes, it would seem that without that early characteristic, none of the other events would have had sufficient impact to actually lead to that line of behaviour. Therefore, it would seem that Harold Shipman was, in fact, born to kill.
How do I feel towards him now? Indifferent.
Quite intelligent young girl.
Very devious.
Plodding through life in the 60s.
She was all for herself.
She's one evil so-and-so.
Innocent, vulnerable, in need of love and care and attention.
She's an evil cow.
She's got the devil in her. She's the devil itself.
Wasn't we lucky? The little ones that got away.
Crimes committed by Moors murderer Myra Hindley shocked the nation. Hindley has been demonised as the most evil woman in Britain. With her lover Ian Brady, Hindley took part in the abduction, sexual abuse, torture and murder of 5 innocent children. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Hindley's supporters claimed that she would not have been capable of murder without the influence of Brady. With the help of criminal psychologist and forensic profiler David Holmes, we aim to delve into the mind of this infamous killer. Was Hindley indoctrinated into Ian Brady's murderous world, or was she quite simply born to kill?
When it comes to the born to kill argument, Myra Hindley is very interesting because she is actually reputed to have had a very normal childhood and then have met this very macabre stranger who then transformed her life into one of evil. Now, that is a very simple story which requires further examination.
Myra Hindley died in prison on November the 15th, 2002, after serving 33 years. She was 60 years old. Myra and Ian might have carried on torturing, sexually assaulting and killing children if it had not been for one man, David Smith, and his confession at Hyde Police Station on October the 7th, 1965. David had witnessed Ian brutally murdering their 5th victim, Edward Evans.
The final murder they committed was that of Edward Evans. He was a teenager, and Brady and Hindley had met him on Central Station and persuaded him to come back to the house with them.
Myra said that Ian picked him up for gay sex. They brought Edward Evans back, and the next and most interesting thing about this death, and the thing that actually stops the whole cycle of killing, is that Ian told Myra to go and fetch David Smith.
David Smith had the reputation of being a neighbourhood hard man. He'd started dating Myra's sister, Maureen. They got married and moved to the nearby Hattersby estate, close to Ian and Myra. The four of them spent a lot of time together. David was impressed by Ian's right-wing views. Slowly he became indoctrinated into Ian's perverse view of life.
Myra went and brought David Smith and brought him back to the house, whereupon Edward Evans was murdered in a very, very brutal fashion. He was much bigger, it was much harder to kill him, there was blood everywhere. It was a very, very nasty death.
Brady had been grooming Myra's brother-in-law for several months and was confident he could trust the 17-year-old to not only keep a secret, but also to become actively involved in their murderous plans. But Brady miscalculated David.
Eventually, Edward Evans was killed and his body was parcelled up and wrapped up, and they took him upstairs with great difficulty and locked him in a bedroom. How much David Smith was involved in the actual killing, he says not, but he said he had to do certain things because Ian was controlling it and forcing him to.
He said he had to do what he had to do, clean up and help Myra and Ian that night, and he had to help them to do everything to save his own neck. Then he went back home and told Maureen what happened.
With a large carving knife to protect them, they went down to the phone box and they phoned the police, and they stood in that phone box until the police arrived, and the pair of them were really, really terrified and horror-struck.
David Smith gave an account of what had happened on that evening. Myra wasn't present during the physical murder, she was actually in the kitchen. But she was certainly involved in the cleaning up of the house afterwards because, as you can imagine, there was an awful lot of blood, and I think it's fair to say that David Smith had certain views about her thoughts at the time. They were flippant remarks about blood and tissue around the room.
The crime scene of the murder of Edward Evans was a grossly blood-splattered affair, in the midst of which Myra Hindley was projecting herself as a laughing, gay, busy housewife, tidying up a normal domestic scene. She normalised what was grossly abnormal. For this particular scene, it helped her to distance herself from the reality, the horror of what she was engaging with.
David and Maureen's story was taken seriously by the police. 24 officers were called to Ian and Myra's house.
David Smith had warned them that there were guns on the premises. They decided that they would do this in a sort of undercover way, so when the knocker went and Myra Hindley answered the door, it was not a policeman on her doorstep, it was a breadman with a basket of bread loaves. Myra said, "We don't have bread," and then he said, "But I'm a policeman," and they went inside. The police insisted on searching the house, which they resisted, but eventually they, of course, had to accede, and the body of Edward Evans was found.
Little did they realise, but the police were about to stumble across one of Britain's most notorious criminal cases, the Moors murders.
Straight away, Ian Brady was arrested, but Myra Hindley was, having been questioned, she was allowed to go home. They didn't believe she was involved. However, because of David Smith's insistence that there were probably more murders involved, the police continued to investigate, and they searched the house very thoroughly. They actually found a list of, which Ian said was the planning for a robbery, and it had enigmatic initials on it, and one of them was PB. And eventually, down the spine of a prayer book, they found a ticket for a left luggage office at a station in Manchester. And they found out which one it was and claimed a suitcase back.
Majority of serial killers take some form of trophy of their crimes away from them, whether it can be rings or it can be jewellery or it can be your hair.
And it was in this suitcase that they found all the photographs and the tapes of Leslie Ann Downey's last few minutes on Earth.
Brady and Hindley were not unusual. They had tape recordings of the torture and the murder and the pleadings of Leslie Ann Downey.
10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey had mysteriously gone missing from the area 6 months earlier. David Smith told the police that Ian had joked about burying children on the moors.
Eventually, with the use of the photographs that had been taken of Myra with her dog and Ian up on the moors, they managed to actually find a place where they thought that they might fruitfully start digging for bodies. Myra was arrested and charged a few days after Ian. Her dog, Puppet, was also taken into custody because the police knew that if they could establish the age of the dog, they would be able to establish when some of these photographs were actually taken. A vet put the dog under general anaesthetic and was trying to establish the age from its teeth. And tragically, Puppet died, and Myra Hindley was heard to scream around the police station, "Murderers!"
As a result of the tip-off that they were digging on the moors, I was a very young reporter, and my job was to drive around at night in the hope that I might see police digging. Saddleworth Moor is quite an eerie place at the best of times, but to be up there in the early hours, in the dark, knowing that there could be, at that stage, could be children buried out there was quite weird. Quite frightening, really, looking back.
There was a whole cavalcade of press parked down the hill and not allowed to get near, and they tried to do as much of it as they could under cover of sort of dawn and dusk, but it was very difficult because you have to have light on the moors. The moors are vast and spooky places.
Police believed that the bodies of 4 missing children might have been buried on the moors. Their fears were well-founded. On the 10th of October 1965, the body of Leslie Ann Downey was discovered. 11 days later, the body of 12-year-old John Kilbride was also uncovered. John had disappeared without a trace on November the 11th, 1963. In 1965, a case like this was unique. For the first time in British history, a woman had been implicated in a killing partnership that involved the serial sex murders of children. What had turned Myra into such a monster? Was it a question of nature, not nurture?
As the details began to emerge, particularly in the local community, there was a sense of outrage. I think if some people could have got their hands on Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, they wouldn't be here today. It's quite difficult to comprehend what they got up to and got away with for so long.
To satisfy the born to kill question regarding Myra Hindley, you have to examine the whole of the period of the killing, but perhaps more importantly, you have to examine the childhood and the aspects of childhood, and you're looking for little events that might say that this person was showing signs prior to the crime period of being born to kill.
Had she not met Ian Brady, I'm absolutely convinced that Myra Hindley would in all probability have led a normal life.
Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were sadosexual killers. These particular murderers become hooked on inflicting torture on their victims. Their pleasure is gained in a perverse game of cat and mouse, stalking, entrapment, and killing of their quarry. In the case of Brady and Hindley, their favoured prey were children.
What normal and everyday person could watch a man sexually abuse a child, torture them, strangle them, murder them, and dig a shallow grave on the moors and put them in it and walk away and sleep at night, which she did for many years.
So how did a seemingly normal child grow into an adult so perverse that she would gain pleasure in the sexual abuse and murder of children?
When looking at serial killers such as Myra Hindley, you have to very carefully examine not only the period when the crimes were being committed, but look very carefully at the childhood in order to separate out those things which may be clearly environmental, those things that may have been biologically there all the time, and those interactions between them.
Myra Hindley was born on Thursday, July the 23rd, 1942. Just another child in a world of terraced houses and factories in the poor working class area of Gorton in Manchester, England.
She was part of a close northern community. She knew everybody in the street, she knew the people at the shops, everybody knew everybody. She went to the same school as all her friends. It was a very supportive, loving local community.
Myra was the first child of Bob and Nellie Hindley, initially a placid child who was no trouble. When her sister Maureen was born 4 years later, the situation changed. Mr. and Mrs. Hindley found bringing up two children too difficult and sent Myra off to live with her grandmother.
Some people try to make a lot of the fact that she didn't actually live at home with Mum and Dad, but she lived, in the next street with Grandma. The two houses could see each other from the bedroom windows, and she spilled between the two houses. It was a very, very loving life. Myra went to the local state school. She went to the junior school where she was bright and only narrowly failed her 11 plus. Granny was very susceptible to allowing her to have a day off if she wanted one, and Myra's attendance record was very poor. And had she gone, she probably would have passed for the grammar school. As it was, she went to Ryder Brow Secondary Modern. She was in the top class. She did extremely well. She was in that vanguard of youth culture, and she was very aware of it. It was the beginning of teenage as a phenomenon. Rock and roll was there, Beatles were coming. She changed her image slowly but surely.
Thick makeup, like a Dusty Springfield.
The hair got blonder.
Big curls in the hair.
The skirts eventually got shorter.
Always had all the top fashions.
Well, it was fantastic. She, peroxide blonde, always did very well for the lads.
Myra had one friend of the opposite sex from quite early on, a little boy called Michael Higgins. She was quite taken with the idea that he had the same initials as her, and they used to hang out together, go everywhere together. She used to be sort of almost looked after him.
Myra felt she'd made a lifelong friend. One sunny afternoon, Michael asked Myra to go swimming with him at the local reservoir. She was unable to go. Tragically, Michael drowned, an unfortunate event that local boy Lawrence Jordan witnessed.
Michael Higgins came with some of his friends and they were swimming over that side. And then all of a sudden there was a flurry of excitement and one or two young kids running round saying, "I can't see him, I can't see him." Somebody must have dialed the police because 2 or 3 policemen came running up and we saw them diving. And one child said, "There's somebody under the water." Somebody then shouted, "Oh, they've got him." And I saw them bringing out this chalk white body. But you could see the whiteness of the body against the blue uniforms of the police, and his arms were outstretched almost in a crucifix. They hurriedly then put him in the mortuary van, and the van then passed us going out where you could get down to it there. The path came to there. It must have been really traumatic for Myra Hindley, because if she was a friend of his and she saw him being brought out, that would obviously stay with her for the rest of her life, because it certainly stayed with me.
And after that, she went in a shell for a while. She was absolutely devastated of the fact that he died. She wasn't the same girl for months and months after that. In fact, it was a year or so, a long time.
She went and visited his parents, his mother, all the time, and she actually converted to Catholicism. Michael had been a Catholic, and she actually converted in the wake of his death.
With Michael, she invested quite a lot and lost quite a lot. And to some degree, although she might have blamed herself, she also blamed everyone else. And this was the beginning of the distancing of her from other people. And also, within this, she would hide in religion. This was another step away from humanity and towards a new kind of aim and career.
It was not long after Michael's death that Myra left school. On her 17th birthday, Hindley became engaged to Ronnie Sinclair, a local boy who worked at the co-op. However, Myra's apparent contentment with her ordinary life didn't last long.
Half the time Myra wanted the sort of classic husband and 2 kids, which all the girls around her aspired to. But there's another part of her that really didn't want to do that.
Being brought up by her grandmother to have a certain sense of self-importance, Myra Hindley did require more from life than simply 2.4 children and a marriage. This would not be stimulating to her. For some women, they require a certain amount of violence, a certain S&M quality to their relationship, and Myra was of this type.
Eventually, she landed a job as a typist secretary at Millward's, which was the place where she ultimately met Ian Brady.
Ian Brady was working in the office at the time. He completely ignored her for many, many months. He was aloof. She describes him as an extremely good-looking individual. He was always well-dressed.
Ian was, quite an attractive, handsome. He used to have this big motorbike that everybody wanted to sort of like go round when you're kids and have a go of it or look at it. And, you know, I think he was just mesmerised by it, wasn't he, really?
Yeah. There wasn't very many motorbikes in Gordon at the time.
She very, very quickly came to be absolutely fascinated by him, and the perfect example of this is she kept this very childish diary in which she wrote things like, "He looked at me today, Ian spoke to me today, Ian is in a bad mood today."
He's not looked at me today. He has looked at me today. Will he take me out at weekend?
At best, Ian Brady was bisexual and probably rather more homosexual than heterosexual. So she was very much on the periphery of his vision.
Till the famous Christmas party when they got together and became an item from there on in. And it was at that stage that he started to indoctrinate her into his views on politics, life, sex, and so on.
That first night, Brady took her to see the Nuremberg trials. As the weeks went by, he played her records of Hitler's marching songs and encouraged her to read some of his favourite books, Mein Kampf, Crime and Punishment, and the works of the Marquis de Sade. Hindley happily complied. She had waited for so long for something different, and now here it was.
Myra's family were not keen on Ian from the very word go. Ian's background had been more dysfunctional than Myra's. He was born in the centre of Glasgow as a result of an affair between his mother, a waitress, and a man whose identity we've never been completely sure about. And he was fostered when he was about 2 to a family who were living nearby. And they brought him up to the best of their ability. However, when he became a teenager, he began to get involved in crime. Eventually, the courts in Glasgow said that he had to go and live with his mother, and his mother at this stage was living in Manchester, so basically Glasgow shipped its problem out.
Brady became Hindley's first lover, and she was soon totally besotted with him, soaking up all of his distorted philosophical theories.
She went from this happy-go-lucky girl to not wanting to speak to anybody, not wanting to be with anybody. It was always you shout Auntie Myra, because, as I say, everybody was your auntie. You'd shout to her and she'd completely ignore you.
She became involved in all his strange sadomasochistic sex. He didn't have a normal sexual appetite.
Brady told Hindley there was no God, so she stopped going to church. When he told her that rape and murder was the supreme pleasure, she did not question it. Her personality had become totally fused with his.
I don't think Ian was in love with Myra. I think it was just what he was doing, really. I think he was playing cat and mouse like he's done all the way along.
Early in 1963, Brady put Hindley's blind acceptance of his ideas to the test. He began planning a bank robbery and needed her to be his getaway driver. Immediately, Hindley began driving lessons, joined the local rifle club, and purchased 2 guns. The robbery was never carried out, but Brady's purpose had been fulfilled. Myra had shown herself to be a willing partner in crime.
He had so many wonderful dreams and schemes, and she was obviously very, very impressed by him. Unfortunately, what Brady actually had in mind was the destruction and torture of children, and she got swept along with it, and the poison infected her.
And that was how they embarked on their first murder.
Pauline Reed was on her way to a dance. She'd left home dressed in her pink party dress.
Myra knew her. Myra pulled up in the car alongside her and asked Pauline if she would come and help her look for a glove. And it transpired that Myra drove her up to the moors, with Ian Brady following on his motorbike close behind. And what we do know is that Pauline got out of the car, presumably went to look for the glove with Myra, and that Ian Brady then came up behind and, as far as we know, hit her with a spade and killed her. And sexually assaulted her.
So to kill Pauline and to walk around the community knowing that everybody was looking for Pauline and held her head high. She didn't even blink, nobody had an inkling or anything.
Almost, Pauline was a dangerous one because they did have some connection with her. He knows that the way to do the murders is to pick up children because they're easy, Myra to do the picking up because that is much the easiest way of doing it, and to do children that they do not know. So that takes them on to meeting John Kilbride.
John was the eldest child. He was almost 12 when he went missing. The last time I saw my brother John was in 1963 on a Saturday morning as I got up. What I used to do every Saturday was going out the market, stallholders, peck away. He just never come home that night. My mum rang the police about 6:30, because he was always home for 6 anyway. And, I mean, he was always home, so 6:30, the police were wrong, sort of thing. He was missing. Yeah. There was posters all over the towns far and wide with Very John's face on lampposts, placards, shop windows. Have you seen this boy?
There was a pub on the corner called the Bessemer, and there was photographs of missing children in the area at the time. Have you seen these children? And she used to go to the bar and have a drink knowing that them children was there and knowing she knew exactly where they was.
In their statement, they said they'd picked him up at Ashton Market. Well, Hindley had. She'd led him to Brady's car.
And again, he was sexually assaulted. He was found with his underpants tied down at the bottom of his legs, and buried again close to the road.
I think after just a few weeks, we all realised he wasn't coming home. We knew he hadn't run away, and we knew something had happened to him, but we didn't know what. Not for 2 years.
The role that Myra Hindley played was always one of the initial contact with the child. Sometimes Brady was absent and came along later, or on other occasions Brady was behind on a motorcycle and he was flashing the headlamp to tell her, there's one coming up now, stop and talk to this individual here.
Last time I saw a kid on the 16th of June, 1964.
Their method of abducting and killing children worked. Myra and Ian were driven to try it again. 6 months later, they chose 12-year-old Keith Bennett.
He went to his grand's, or he should have gone to his grand's, and he didn't get there. He was walking down Plymouth Grove West, crossed Stockport Road and into one of the side streets. She seen him at the top end of the entry, so she went round and collared him and picked him up, said something to him, and he went in the car, no messing, because he thought he was doing a good turn to somebody. So when my mum come down on the 16th of June, I said, where's Keith? She said, I don't know. I said, well, he should have been at your house. And then I thought, well, I better go to the police station and tell them. And they said it'd give you 48 hours to get back. I said, well, where could he be? I said, he's not gone with any mates. I said, he never does that. I said, he comes straight home from school and that was it. But he disappeared and that was it. Two months after, the police come to the door with Brady and Hindley's photo. He said, well, we think it's possible that these have had something to do with Keith, you know, with Keith abducting him.
There is a slight difference with Keith because they take him deep onto the moors. At least 3/4 of a mile, which is quite a long way for a small child.
He hit him on the back of the head, knocked him out, and then put a machine cord rubber around his neck and broke his neck. And he actually assaulted him afterwards and left the clothes at the side where they buried him. He didn't know he was going to his death.
By this stage, Ian was living with Myra and her granny in Hattersley, which is an overspill town near Hyde, just outside Manchester. And they moved in, and the neighbours were very impressed by them because Ian got stuck into making a garden, did up the house. The word yuppie didn't exist in those days, but if it had, these would have been seen as a kind of upwardly mobile young couple.
A further 6 months passed before the next abduction.
The fourth victim was Leslie Ann Downey, a young girl that they picked up at a fun fair in Manchester. And Myra, again, persuaded her to come in the car, and they took her home. This one is different because they took her back to their house in Hattersley. And there hasn't been an enormous amount of scope for torture and taking photographs and making tape recordings. But now that they've got a victim actually in their own house, they can indulge in all of that. And they ran a tape recorder, and this tape recording is, in fact, perhaps one of the most shocking things you will ever hear, but it's also the thing that completely condemned Myra Hindley in court.
Her voice is heard on the tape, and it's telling the little girl to be quiet because clearly she was very distressed indeed. And she explained that she was very worried at the time that the neighbours might hear the little girl crying, and that was the concern.
And Leslie Ann Downey is pleading with her, please, Mum. She calls her Mum all the way through, as though by appealing to Myra's maternal instincts she might make this whatever awful things are happening. But Myra is gagging her, ties a gag around her. We don't know what abuse happened. Myra claims that there was no sexual abuse. There probably was. And the next day they took Leslie Ann Downey up to the moors and buried her.
The killing of Leslie Ann Downey marked a significant change in the killing career of Myra Hindley. The risk and the confidence to actually kill somebody within feet and inches of neighbours rather than out here on the moors.
It would be another 10 months before Leslie Ann's body was discovered on the moors in a shallow grave with her clothing at her feet. Even with the damning evidence mounting against them, Brady and Hindley denied murdering Leslie Ann. As in the case of Edward Evans, they attempted to implicate David Smith. They claimed that Smith had brought the girl to the house so that Brady could photograph her. As far as they were concerned, Leslie Ann had left their house unharmed with Smith.
Ian Brady tried to protect Myra, and it's true that if Myra had played it the way he wanted it to, she would probably have been charged with being accessory and possibly been out of prison after 7 or 8 years. But she was determined that she was in this with Ian. All she said was, Ian is innocent and I am innocent, and she said this over and over again.
The evidence that linked Brady and Hindley to the murder of John Kilbride, while not as overwhelming, was sufficient to charge them. They found the name John Kilbride in Brady's handwriting, written in his notebook, and a photograph of Hindley on John's grave on the moors.
I actually got ready myself to go and help on the dig, and I was more or less locked in my bedroom by my father. A couple of days after the police came with a chute, my mum identified it as being John's, and they found John's body then.
Despite all their efforts, the police were unable to find the bodies of the other 2 missing children, or any evidence to link Brady and Hindley to their disappearance.
Ian Brady was charged with the 3 murders of the ones the police had the bodies of. That was Leslie Ann Downey, John Kilbride and Edward Evans. Myra was charged with Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans, and of being an accessory to the killing of John Kilbride. Ian Brady received 3 life sentences and Myra received 2.
Myra was taken to Holloway Prison.
I put them all in a big enough hole to bury the bloody lot of them throw acid on them and then throw the soil on top of them and burn them alive, because that's all they need. Because them kind of people are not worth the salt of the earth. As far as I'm concerned, anyway.
In order to evaluate the degree of influence Ian Brady had on Myra Hindley's criminality, you have to examine the point at which they were separated. Myra Hindley's behaviours will indicate whether or not he was the causal factor, or whether or not Myra Hindley was born to kill.
Over Myra Hindley continued for the first few years of their incarceration. They constantly wrote to each other and even requested permission to marry. The rift that developed between them was gradual, stemming mainly from their differing responses to their imprisonment. Brady quickly accepted his sentence and soon settled into prison life, whereas Hindley continued to assert her innocence, maintaining her claim that Brady and Smith were responsible for the murders.
Myra Hindley said she didn't have any involvement, only, in her words at the time, was acquiring the children for Ian Brady. But she was distinctly heard on a tape of Leslie Ann Downey telling the little girl to shut her mouth, while Brady was, God knows what he was doing to her.
Her mother was convinced she was innocent. Her sister was convinced she was innocent. Everybody around her was convinced by Myra that Myra had just been Ian Brady's dupe.
Myra Hindley's mind, the story was in place regardless of her innocence, and she would gather together anyone who would listen, give her time, and certainly anyone who would give her any publicity that might support her plea of innocence.
In 1970, Hindley broke off all contact with Brady. His hold on her was completely broken by the realization that she would never see him again. 7 years later, more than 10 years after her imprisonment, Hindley began a campaign to win her freedom, a crusade that continued until the day she died.
Ian Brady's never actually applied for parole. He was willing to serve his sentence, but at least he knew what he'd done, and he didn't want to come out of prison. Myra Hindley applied for parole on a regular basis, just to torment the families, as far as I'm concerned.
Hindley's application for parole was delayed for a further 3 years. When Hindley's plea was finally heard in 1985, 20 years since she was first in prison, it was rejected. The Home Secretary announced that Hindley's case would not be heard again for at least another 5 years.
Ultimately, she hoped she would be able to get out of prison, and that was probably her long-term objective.
At the end of 1986, Hindley changed her tactics. Instead of continuing to plead her innocence, she made a full public confession.
A conjunction of people came together in Myra's life. She had a solicitor who was saying to her, unless you make a clean breast of everything, admit it, and then possibly down the line parole will be possible. At the same time, she was being counselled by Lord Longford to make a confession. She also received a letter from Winnie Johnson, the mother of Keith Bennett.
When I wrote to her, she said she was very sorry that she couldn't help me in any way. She was watching out for Brady on the hill. And she wasn't, she was as bad as him. She watched them kids murdered, and she watched them being raped.
And at the same moment, because Ian Brady had made a sort of confession to a journalist, the Home Office ordered Greater Manchester Police to reopen the investigation.
Well, the aim was to review the case and see whether there were any fresh lines of inquiry we could pursue with a view to, first and foremost, finding out where the two children might have been buried, and secondly, of course, gaining confessions.
She now admitted both the knowledge of and involvement in all 5 murders, including those of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett.
She was cooperative right from the word go and said that she was prepared to point out to us areas of interest to Brady on Saddleworth Moor, which was really code for giving us a pretty good steer as to where bodies may be.
When it emerged in the 80s that there could be 2 more bodies on the moors, and there was a likelihood of either Hindley or Brady turning up to try and pinpoint them, there was what you would call a newspaper frenzy. Many newspapers hired helicopters. I was up there. It was chaotic.
She was very keen on trying to help us. I have no doubt about that at all.
You have to realise that for Myra Hindley, this was actually keyed off by her lawyer saying that unless she did appear to the public as a reformed character, that her release would probably never ever happen. Therefore, can you disentangle her self-interest in doing this from any genuine apparent remorse that was revealed?
She pointed out or identified the areas that we'd already been searching. It was not until the following spring that we actually started excavating those two areas. And of course, in the summer of the following year, we found Pauline Reed's body in one of the areas that she'd highlighted.
And they found Pauline Reed. Now, I met her mother, and she's a lovely person, or she was a lovely person. And she used to always say to me, "Winnie, they will find Keith. I know it, they've got to find him, and they will find him."
He's been missing now for 41 years this summer. I doubt whether we'll ever find his body because they say that the landscape moves and changes in that time. And Keith's mum, Winnie, is absolutely obsessed by this. She says she can't rest until she lays her boy. She has even been up there with a spade in that forlorn hope that she could find her boy.
I love it up here because I know Keith's up here watching me. Other than that, I wouldn't come up, but I know he's up here and I know he knows I'm up here and he knows I'm putting flowers on the fence for him. No matter what hell or fire, I'll have him back. He shouldn't have been up here in the first place.
I've been up on the moors quite a lot in my lifetime, and it's just not a nice feeling. It's not a nice feeling at all, but at least we have got our John where we can go and visit. Winnie Johnson still looking for her son. After 40 years, she's still looking for her son.
Keith's body has never been found, but Hindley's confession has given his family some indication of how he died. Hindley had lured him into the car with a request for assistance in loading some boxes. Once at Saddleworth Moor, Brady had taken Keith down to the gully, where he raped and then strangled him, burying him somewhere nearby. At the time of her confession, Hindley's solicitor expressed his belief that her chances of parole were greatly enhanced by her display of remorse.
In 1988, she approached me to see if I could represent her at a time when she was making a number of important legal challenges to the High Court. And people said, well, look, Andrew, you've got to be careful. This is the most manipulative woman in the country. Be careful she doesn't manipulate you. Well, I've had many clients over the years seek to manipulate me. I can say Myra never did.
Myra Hindley, as far as I could see, was an extremely clever and manipulative woman who managed to play the establishment to her own ends and draw people to her cause.
The criminal justice system has always recognised that if you change and if you reform, you should be granted parole. All the experts were of the opinion that she had reformed.
If you want to understand Myra Hindley, you have to compare her prison career with that of Ian Brady, who became a tortured man. Myra Hindley did not. She became a well-spoken, articulate defender of her own innocence.
But I believe that she changed back from that evil persona to a genuinely sorry woman for the dreadful crimes that she had committed with Brady.
What she hoped to gain by applying for parole, I don't know, because she could actually have been charged with the murders of 2 more children. And this is what I'd have pushed for if she'd have got parole.
Whilst in prison, Myra rediscovered her faith in Catholicism. She continued to express remorse for her crimes. I ask people to judge me as I am now and not as I was then.
A lot of people turn to religion in prison to impress one group of people in particular, and that is the parole board. Killers, every killer in America must be on a journey into the light, must have seen Christ, and the first thing they do on a Sunday is queue up for tea and biscuits in the church.
Her aim in life was to walk free, and she wouldn't have been free very long. I'd have loved her. I'd have loved it for him to drop her on Aston Market or outside my front door. I'd have loved it. I'd have served time for her.
I'm certain in my mind that if Myra Hindley had never met Ian Brady, she would never have been involved in murder.
She would have moved heaven and earth to do anything to please him.
You could call it a tragic love story, but I don't think you could put the word love in this. Not when you think what they did.
Without the influence of Ian Brady, it is very, very unlikely that Myra Hindley would have killed another person. However, her searching for a stimulating, exciting life may have ended up with her being with some drug dealer, some bank robber, who would give her an exciting life, but wouldn't necessarily have involved her in one-to-one killing.
Just haven't got words to explain how I feel about her. That sort of thing just did not happen where we lived.
On November the 15th, 2002, at the age of 60, Myra Hindley died from respiratory failure, arising from a serious chest infection. She'd suffered a suspected heart attack 2 weeks earlier.
She's got the devil in it. She's the devil itself.
In this particular instance, Myra Hindley was not born to kill, but she was placed in a circumstance where an element that she was born with enabled her to continue and kill.
Who's to say she could be here? Maureen, David, all of them could be here. You know?
Still living in Gorton.
Still living in Gorton.
And then again at the other side of the
Could be married.
So could Pauline.
Their own children. Yeah, of course.
She could have been here as well.
She could have been here.